The story starts with a kid playing a strategy RPG on his PC, even while in the hospital. Out of nowhere, his body gets heavy, everything goes black, and his mind is sucked into an imaginary ocean. Until, suddenly, he wakes up in a forest, sitting all cool on a stone throne. And to complete the isekai combo, a woman approaches, speaking to him as if she'd been waiting for the handsome guy to wake up. When she steps out of the shadows, it hits the kid right away. It was none other than Atu Amacinta, an elf who called him king. The game he was playing in the hospital was a dark fantasy strategy simulator called Eternal Nations, and the character he loved most, the one standing right in front of him now, was this very elf. Now, he couldn't help but wonder, should he act like the king she claimed he was? It was clear she saw him as the leader of Minogra. Sensing his confusion, the girl smiles and says, "It's all right, Takuto." After all, he beat Nightmare difficulty using what was considered the hardest civilization in the game, the ruined civilization, Minogra. Because of that, Era Takuto became the legendary player at the very top of the global leaderboard. Atu, for her part, remembered every moment they played together, how they had conquered the world side by side time and again, so there was no need for him to worry, she knew exactly who he was. Thinking back, Takuto realized Atu matched his own playstyle, maybe because he'd always wanted to be as strong as she was. Tears welled up in his eyes as he admitted how happy he was to finally speak to his favorite character. She said she felt the same. Takuto asked if this was heaven, and if Atu was the one who'd brought him here, but she explained that she, too, had simply appeared in this place out of the blue, and it didn't seem much like paradise. If anything, she thought, it felt more like the world of Eternal Nations, no doubt about it. She said it was a miracle, and it was a true honor to meet her master in person. With that, the elf knelt before the boy, took his hand, and invited him to start again, just the two of them, building a kingdom of their own. As tempting as the offer was, Takuto was still lost in confusion. Even so, with his loyal companion by his side, maybe this was his chance to relive those golden days in this new world. So, Takuto called on his servant to begin their journey together. Au Amacinta introduced herself as the child born from the mud who will bring destruction to the world, declaring that, from now on, her body and mind belonged solely to her master. Hearing this over-the-top speech, Takuto cringed so hard he almost had a stroke. He realized that saying this stuff in real life is way harder than in the game, and Atu admitted it was a little embarrassing for her, too. Still, the king decided to play along, calling the elf his first and only subordinate, his confidant and right hand. Then Takuto asked if his servant knew what Minogra's first move should be, and in perfect sync, the two replied, "Let's go into hiding." Next, Takuto summons a scout using emergency production. Without delay, a creature known as a long-legged insect crawls out of a portal, a sight both Takuto and Atu found a bit gross, to be honest. Still, Takuto reminded himself that Minogra was a civilization of moderation that wielded evil and ruin, so they'd need to keep that in mind. For Atu, that meant they had to do everything possible to avoid revealing their true identities. First order from the king, he sent the insect to scout the area without being seen. Watching the bug scuttle off, Takuto realized he could see through its eyes. That summoning had cost him 100 mana, leaving him with 100 more. To set up the base, the operations sector, would cost another 20. Atu lays down the law that emergency production costs a ton of mana, so they should be careful with their spending. Takuto admitted he really wanted to create a warrior to defend them, but that would probably drain all his mana. Speaking of combat, the elf pledged to do her best, or at least, that's what she wanted to say, if she weren't so weak right now. Takuto understood. Atu was a hero unit who got stronger over time, but at the moment her strength was only 3, less than even some basic enemies. In short, their entire plan to build Minogra was at serious risk if they were attacked by pretty much anything. Using the scout's vision, Takuto surveyed the land around them, forest as far as the eye could see. So far, no monsters in sight. Au thought the forest was a perfect place to hide, but found it strange that the long-legged insect hadn't spotted a single animal along the way. Even worse, Takuto realized there was absolutely nothing to eat. All they could do was stay alert and hope something turned up. Atu apologized for not being more helpful, but the boy told her that just having her company was more than enough, making her eyes shine with joy. Seeing her so moved, he thought to himself how hard it had been to notice these little things in the game, but Atu's personality really was just like this. Putting that aside, through the scout's eyes, Takuto soon discovered a community of dark elves not far away. He explained that this type of elf tended to be neutral, maybe leaning a bit toward evil, which, honestly, was a relief. At the very least, it confirmed that they really were in the world of eternal nations. On the downside, if there was another civilization's settlement nearby, it could spell trouble. Avoiding war at the start of the game was crucial. So, their top priority was to find a safe place to settle, but before that, they needed to keep an eye on the Dark Elves and gather more information. If things went south, they'd just have to make a run for it. Suddenly, speak of the devil, a small group of Dark Elves appeared before the stone throne where Minogure's two companions sat. To them, our man Takuto was just a shadowy, sinister figure, a vision so terrifying it made their leader, Jia, break out in a cold sweat. Convinced he was witnessing the devil himself, incarnate, knowing his actions could decide the fate of his entire race, Jia composed himself and stepped forward. Bowing, he introduced his companions as members of the Mazeram clan. His own name was Jia Najeev, and he apologized for entering the forest without permission from what appeared to be the master of these lands. With a chilling expression, Atu recognized that this elf truly understood the gravity of trespassing here, but wanted to know the reason. Jia explained that their clan lived in Iragia, but they were persecuted and forced to flee into the forest. He tried to tell their whole story, but Atu pressed him to keep it brief, making Jia more and more anxious not to make a mistake that would put his people at risk. Amidst this, Takuto commented on how thin the Dark Elves looked, and Jia admitted, with a heavy heart, that they hadn't found any food there. The elf then wondered why his clan had to endure so much suffering, when all they wanted was a peaceful place to live. Out of nowhere, the supposed master of the shadowy forest offered him a handful of apples. Takuto mentioned that they taste delicious if you cut them into the shape of a rabbit. Jia had never seen fruit like this and wondered if it would be rude to try one on the spot. But the rest of his group was too hungry for such concerns. They bit into the apples and smiles spread across their faces. But that wasn't all. Takuto opened a portal and handed out pears as well. Jia bowed even lower, saying there were others like them, including small, starving children. So, instead of eating now, he asked for permission to take the fruit back to the others. Takuto listened, felt sorry for them, and handed over even more food, this time with bread and vegetables too. Witnessing what seemed like a miracle, Jia Najeev reflected on how the Dark Elves had always been despised. Marked by scorn, Jia's people were forced to live in the shadows, and no one had ever reached out to help them. Overwhelmed by such power and mercy, Najeev finally dared to ask, who was this individual sitting on the throne? Meanwhile, back at the Dark Elf settlement, those who hadn't traveled were doing their best to bear the hunger. Then, suddenly, the foraging party returned, their leader grinning from ear to ear with the best news possible. The famine was finally over. With all that food, joy swept through the whole village. Later, while the community slept, Najeev sat by a campfire. The old elder Moulter came over to compliment the chief on his work. Moulter said he'd lived a long life, but never had he seen such strange and delicious fruit. Najeev agreed. And that was exactly why the old man wanted to know what had led the clan to such circumstances. Ready to share the truth, Jia said he'd met a legendary being deep in the forest. According to legend, a being was sealed away in the cursed lands. Moulter was stunned, wondering if the expedition had encountered the ruined king, a figure found in old books and stories. When the world reached its limit, the ruined king would appear, bringing devastation to all. As much as no one could say for sure, it was also impossible to say the legend was just a lie. Jia, for his part, never caught the being's name, but had to admit that the frightening appearance fit the title of Ruined King all too well. The entity was simply beyond comprehension, but at least he had a servant who could clarify his words. Whatever the case, even without certainty, Moulter senses that this is nothing good. Now that his stomach and a bit of his mana are replenished, the elder can feel it clearly. This forest is far from normal. He wonders if Jia gave the entity something in exchange for the food. But the chief insists that's not the case. Molter doesn't buy it. He argues that the King of Ruin would never do a good deed without expecting something in return. But Jia swears there was no price. It genuinely seemed to be an act of mercy. His Grace, as Jia calls him, saw the dire situation the Dark Elves were in and showed them compassion. Hearing this, Elder Molter is infuriated that Jia would refer to the King of Ruin as His Grace, and starts to suspect that the leader has fallen under the entity's spell. That's when an argument breaks out between these two pillars of the community. Jia insists they owe the utmost respect to someone who fed their people. In fact, he turns the question back on the elder, asking what he would have done. But even Molter can't answer, so he apologizes. From now on, he declares, as the head of the Maze Ram Dark Elves, he'll personally handle matters with the King of Ruin. After all, Molter has lived for 2 centuries, he's sure he can figure something out. Meanwhile, back with Minogra's founders, Atu scolds her master for blowing through a bunch of mana to feed the Dark Elves, reminding him that they need to start building their own nation. Takuto, a little sheepish, admits that he needs his companion now more than ever. Hearing this, Atu drops her tough act and slips into a weirdly love-struck, submissive mode, as if a single kind word from her master is enough to make her melt completely. Takuto, meanwhile, laments that he just couldn't manage to communicate properly with the Dark Elves. No matter how hard he tried, the words just wouldn't come out. Atu confesses she thought he was just trying to act like a mysterious mastermind who hates long speeches and lets his subordinates handle the details. But the truth is, my friends, the kid is just terrible at communication. He never was in his previous life, and it's not like he was suddenly going to become a master of rhetoric and charisma overnight. In other words, he wasn't quiet to look cool, he was quiet because he's shy as hell. The next day, the Elder Molter asks the young elf leader if he's ready to return to the place where the King of Ruin awaits them. As soon as the elf agrees, the experienced elder gets a bad feeling about it, worried about what that entity might want in return for helping his people. Even though Jia insists he never mentioned any kind of payment, the old elf knows the score. After all, evil beings always expect some kind of reward. Regardless, he understands the Dark Elves need the king's help to survive. Jia agrees, pointing out that even if they left the forest to search for food, they could still come back empty-handed. Speaking of leaving the forest, Molter reminds them that one of their hopes is for the clan to reach the Dark Continent and find a kingdom where they won't be hunted, and that maybe this is their last chance. With that said, both leaders agree on one thing. The fate of their people is in their hands. But what they don't know is that our boy Takuto is spying on this whole conversation thanks to his scout. The scene then changes, where the scout quickly returns to his master to report that the Dark Elves would be arriving soon. Atu, our protag servant, already suspected the elves wouldn't be able to carry all the food in a single trip. Takuto, for his part, points out that having people with different cultures and technologies nearby could easily lead to conflict. In fact, he'd prefer if they just took the rest of the food and got the hell out as fast as possible. But the truth is, he's worried he won't be able to negotiate with the elves because of his communication problem, which could cause misunderstandings down the line. Seeing this, Atu offers to handle the negotiations on her master's behalf, which would also serve to elevate the king's grandeur. He accepts and thanks her. The scene changes once more, and now we see that as night falls, Jia arrives before the King of Ruin, accompanied by the tribe's elder, who introduces himself as Molter Cordal Mazrim. First things first, Molter expresses his gratitude for the king's generosity, and then asks for the honor of learning his great name. Cautiously, Atu looks at the king, who gives a nod of approval. Taking the hint, she introduces him as Ira Takuto, Lord of the Apocalypse and Ruler of Ruin, and demands he be treated as formally as possible, leaving Jia visibly impressed. Atu also introduces herself, and Molter vows to engrave both their names into the very soul of his people. Watching silently, Takuto thinks everything is going smoothly so far. After that, Atu tells the elves they can take the food and leave. Molter then asks how he could repay the King of Ruin for his help, but the elf woman immediately waves it off, insisting they could never offer anything worthy of the king's greatness. Besides, since the Mazrim clan has nothing valuable enough to match such generosity, Atu interprets this as a suspicious attitude, which makes the exchange tense. She questions if the elves are planning something behind all this empty talk. Sensing the tension in the air, Takuto whispers a few things into his servant's ear. She flips out, grumbling that these elves are terrible negotiators and that if they don't leave the king alone, they'll only cause trouble and should be annihilated for it. Raising her voice, Atu declares that their heads would look perfect mounted on pikes. Takuto, meanwhile, tells everyone to calm down, guessing that the Mazrim just want to build a relationship that benefits everyone. So, maybe it's best to accept some form of compensation just to put their minds at ease. With that, Atu turns to the Dark Elves and announces that the king is willing to accept a token of gratitude for his charity. As relief washes over the Mazrim's faces, Takuto realizes the elder must have suspected a catch, considering the King of Ruin's evil alignment. Picking up on these unspoken cues, Atu calls the old man a fool for thinking Ira Takuto is some wicked ghost or malevolent spirit. Setting that aside, since she has no idea what to actually ask for in return, she thinks for a moment and decides it would be good to hear everything the Dark Elves know about the world beyond the forest. Molter offers to share all his knowledge, and Atu demands that the Mazrim clan leave the forest once their pact is fulfilled. Gia is clearly shaken by this demand, and Takuto immediately sees he's much easier to read than the elder. Molter admits that nothing would make his clan happier than being allowed to stay in the forest, but Atu won't allow it. Furthermore, if the Mazrim want to keep the lives that were spared, they must not speak of what happened here. Faced with the weight of this ultimatum, Gia seems ready to protest, but Molter calms him and resumes the negotiations, expressing gratitude for the audience with the king and agreeing to everything Atu laid out. As the Dark Elves depart, Takuto wonders if this is really the right thing to do. After all, if the Mazrim are exiled, they'll likely collapse somewhere along the way. Knowing that exile could very well mean death, the King of Ruin extends his hand and invites the elves to become his subjects. Outraged, Atu asks what the hell the king is thinking. He explains he was considering using the refugee system. After all, Dark Elves aren't inherently good or evil, but if they're accepted as refugees into the civilization Takuto plans to build, and if things work like they did in the game, the elves would eventually become evil like them. Atu agrees it's possible for beings of different evil alignments to coexist, but points out that Dark Elves are nothing like Minogra's main citizens, the homunculi, which could create friction. Takuto admits it's risky, but asks Atu to jog her memory and remember what the homunculi look like, and if she could handle living with only those creatures as citizens. She admits it's impossible to put up with their ugliness and stupidity for all eternity and that it would mess with their minds. Atu turns to the Mazrim and announces her master's intention to soon found a nation. If the elves are willing to become citizens, they'll be protected by the king and promised eternal happiness. Last but not least, Atu tells them the real deal. The Dark Elves will become evil beings. With that, they're free to choose their own fate. But, adding a personal note, Atu assures them their side is a lot more fun than it looks. In the next scene, while walking toward the Dark Elves tribe, Atu kept reminding Takuto to watch his step, since he was barefoot. She pointed out that, although it took some time, the Mazrim had finally agreed to become citizens of Minogra. Even though they hesitated at the idea of becoming evil, deep down, they knew from the start this was their best option. Eventually, the pair arrived at the tribe and were greeted by the people, all kneeling in respect. Some looked genuinely excited at the sight of that mysterious entity, while one elf even fainted after feeling the dark miasma swirling around him up close. Soon after, Takuto was led to a throne, and Atu formally welcomed all the Dark Elves as citizens of Minogra, which was now officially founded. From that moment on, the safety of every member of the Mazrim clan would be protected by the great King of Ruin. Still confused, Gia wondered if that was all that would happen. He'd been told that he and his companions would become evil, but he didn't feel any different. Suddenly, a deep-seated hatred welled up inside him, a rage against those who had hunted, mocked, and exiled his people from their own land. Another elf felt the same, which made her declare that she hated every living being in existence. The same feeling could be seen on the faces of every elf in the tribe. Amid all this, Takuto approached Jia to ask if he was alright, and the Mazrim leader realized that this, too, was a form of happiness, the joy of being cared for. Then, with tears in their eyes, all the elves greeted King Ira Takuto, their enthusiasm so overwhelming that even the king himself had no idea why everyone was so worked up. Meanwhile, Atu simply smiled with pride and satisfaction. A few days after founding the nation, Takuto looked at the map of the continent that Molter had given him and muttered that he was cornered. Atu asked what was going on and, flailing on the floor like a kid throwing a tantrum, the leader complained that their kingdom had the worst possible starting position, as there were already two major nations on the continent. To the east was the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, a human civilization devoted to the holy god Arlos, and to the west, Elna, a kingdom of elves who worship nature. In other words, if either of those nations discovered their evil nation to the south, there wouldn't be anything left but dust, especially since Minogra was just starting out and still incredibly weak. To make matters even worse for our protagonist and his people, these lands were so cursed they didn't have a single natural resource they could harvest. However, it wasn't all a tragedy. They remembered that Minogra had the homunculi as its base population, who, as fertile and happy as they might be, were still dumb and consequently made it impossible to produce any research. But now, for the first time, the nation didn't have to rely solely on them, since the Dark Elves were part of the kingdom and could cover those weaknesses. Speaking of which, Atu's ears twitched. She announced that the elves were back, ready to report on the outside world. Without delay, the tribe's elder met with the King of Ruin, alongside the other elf leader. This time, Jia brought his assistant, Emil, since she was smart and well-versed in legends and the ways of other nations. Turning to plans for the future, Atu revealed that the Mazrim would be assigned to key positions in Minogra's administration. Molter would oversee state affairs, since he could use magic and it was a position of great responsibility. Jia would lead Minogra's warriors, also taking charge of recruiting new forces. Jia enthusiastically accepted the new role and promised that if the king commanded, he would show no mercy to any enemy and would display their impaled corpses as a warning. Hearing this, Takuto nearly crapped his pants, leaving Jia genuinely confused. To smooth things over, Atu explained that Takuto preferred peace, which left Jia kind of bugging out. After all, why the hell would the King of Ruin be a pacifist? Anyway, with everyone's role set, Atu told the elves to get some good rest, and when they were in good health, to start building houses. Seeing that Jia had put his foot in his mouth, Molter expressed his deepest gratitude to the king and insisted that, unlike Jia, who only took pride in his muscles, the elder would prove his worth with wisdom. Jia fired back, promising to show off his own vitality, something an old man like Molter could never match. Unsure what to say, Emil just mentioned that she'd work hard, leading Atu to whisper to Takuto that these people seemed a little obsessed with work. Finally, she asked if she should order the gathering of resources, but Takuto suggested developing the area without destroying the forest. Hearing that, Atu turned to Elder Molter to ask if they could collect wood while keeping parts of the forest intact. The elf assured her they could. Their people had always lived in harmony with nature. Hearing this, Jia was baffled not just by how peaceful these elves could be, but also by the fact that the King of Ruin wanted to protect the flora and fauna, despite being considered evil. But that wasn't all. Takuto declared that his citizens should always be reforesting, though it was clear that the Dark Elves had no idea what that meant. Thinking back to the game's tech tree, Takuto guessed, based on what he'd heard so far, that the people in this world were probably at a technological level somewhere around fortress construction. Atu asked if the Dark Elves were familiar with terms like military magic and the 6 main elements. Molter replied that he knew of the 4 main elements, a basic concept in magic. Emil added that she'd never heard any other nation mention military magic. So Atu realized that this world hadn't reached the level of 6-element magic technology yet and was behind in other areas, too. Setting that aside, the elf explained that reforestation was the practice of planting trees where they'd been harvested in order to maintain the environment. Emil admitted this strategy wasn't part of their tradition, while the elder noted that, in reality, it takes centuries for trees to mature after they've been cut down. Atu goes on to say that reforestation is a kind of technology that requires all the main elements and that this knowledge, in fact, comes from their mighty king Ira Takuto. She makes a point of letting everyone know that their king is 100 times more amazing than anyone could imagine, and Takuto can't help but feel a bit embarrassed by all the praise. Still, Atu insists that their ruler's wisdom covers countless fields and that the people of Minogra are blessed to receive his favor. Emil asks if the apples they were given are also the king's invention, and Atu, without batting an eye, confirms they are, and then casually adds that the grapes are his creation too. Speaking of which, Emil says she planted the seeds of that purple fruit and can't wait to watch them grow. At that moment, Takuto realizes he could use emergency production to create things that don't even exist in the game, like gunpowder, metals, and oil. And as soon as the king realizes this, the nation of Minogra is granted the divine privilege, the ruler's ability to produce anything he knows about, with the mana cost varying based on the item's complexity. The scene changes, and now we see a group of soldiers protecting religious figures in a snow-covered region. One of them comments that he's heard the saint has a special power, though he doesn't really believe it. The other, however, just tells him to wait and see. And as soon as he says that, a horde of goblins attacks the group. The saint steps forward, preparing to punish the invaders for disturbing the peace of the holy kingdom of Qualia. With a single sweep of her staff, she conjures an extraordinary flame that barbecues the monsters, causing the sky to open up and fill the field with beautiful flowers. According to an officer, this power is part of the reason the kingdom of Qualia can keep evil at bay. She buries her enemies in flames and sends them off with flowers. She is one of the 7 great saviors of the continent, Saint Soalina of the Flowered Burials. Beside her, the cardinal announces he's already dispatched the paladins to the nearby villages. The saint, however, brings up the ominous prophecy of an apocalypse in the cursed lands, insisting that paladins should be sent there as well. But the cardinal refuses, saying that showing any interest in the cursed lands is out of the question and that Central Command would never authorize such a mission. Even so, the saint says she'll investigate on her own if she has to, leading the man to remind her she's no longer a simple country girl. Seeing he can't change her mind, he finally agrees to send the paladins under his personal command. With that settled, the cardinal walks away, muttering insults about the country bumpkin saint, while she remains focused only on saving the people of that region. The scene then changes, and over in the cursed lands, Atu rallies the people to get to work and build the nation. Part of that process was building the throne where King Takuto would sit. The elf was so excited she believed Minogra would soon become powerful enough to rule the land and pierce the very heavens. In the midst of this, the elven administrators present themselves to the king to kick off the council meeting and hand the leader a set of garments so he can finally dress like a true king. With that done, Atu announced it was time to discuss domestic policies, though Takuto seemed far more interested in admiring his new little outfit and his throne than in deciding the nation's future. Embarrassed, his assistant decided to first discuss things among themselves and only consult the king on certain key points. As the meeting begins, Molter asks which buildings should be erected. Jiao explains they've already started preparing the land. Atu replies that the first project will be a food production facility. After all, you can't wage war on an empty stomach. Molter wonders if the king couldn't just use his powers to create an endless supply of food. Our dear Atu is offended by the suggestion that their leader should be stuck doing that all the time. Besides, she points out, they'd still have to figure out how to distribute the food as the nation grew. After Molter apologizes, the king's assistant places a strange plant on the table that makes the other elves recoil. She explains it's a meat tree, in other words, one of their civilization's food production facilities, which produces a mysterious meat that tastes like human flesh. Molter mentions that not everyone could handle eating human meat every day, but Atu says they'll only plant those trees to start. She adds that they'll need a hut to manage the tree and a storehouse for the food, and Emil is put in charge of that. At that moment, this devil nicknamed a tree asks them to be nice to it, sending Emil into a pure state of panic. The next topic on the council's agenda was research. In Atu's view, as a small nation, they urgently needed to acquire advanced magical technologies, a sentiment the king shared with enthusiasm. Molter confesses he was also happy to study magic, since it was a passion of his. He asks what kind of magic they'd be researching, and Atu doesn't hesitate, saying it's military magic. She explains that normal magic can only hit dozens of enemies at once, while military magic can decimate armies of thousands, reshape the land, and offer all sorts of strategic advantages. Molter and Jia are amazed that such spells even exist. Takuto assures them it's not a particularly difficult technology, so it should be developed quickly. With that said, Elder Molter enthusiastically takes charge of researching military magic. Last on the agenda was military planning. Jia points out that they first needed to organize an army. Takuto replies that they wouldn't focus on that just yet, while Atu explains that not only do armies not produce anything, they also consume resources. Jia understands but reminds everyone that their current group of warriors isn't enough to protect the king. To make matters worse, Molter reveals that both he and Jia have bounties on their heads. Faced with this situation, King Takuto declares that they will create a hero. Atu loves the idea. The hero might be expensive to produce, but it has virtually no upkeep costs. Jia asks what exactly this hero would be, and the elf explains that in Minogra, there are several heroes who serve the king. All of them are powerful and possess unique abilities, though they're all monsters in their own right. There are various conditions that must be met to summon them, but soon they should be able to call at least one. Besides, as the king reminded everyone, armies are expensive and draw too much attention. Taking that into consideration, creating a hero could be a smart move. And with that decided, they set out to create a hero and give Jia the peace of mind he so desperately needed. After making that decision, Takuto remarks that, honestly, discussing internal policies is actually kind of fun. But leaving that aside, he reflects that they're also collecting mana from their citizens, which means the nation's mana reserves are in good shape. The amount they collect is directly tied to the people's happiness. Therefore, the happier the citizens, the more the nation thrives. The scene then changes once more, and now we go to the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, where a warrior named Lonius has his prayer interrupted by a supposed emergency. He's not happy about Vertil's lack of respect for the sacred place. As Lonius tucks his ring away, Vertil jokes that the man's wedding band must have become a lucky charm. He asks the names of Lonius's wife and daughter, but he's ignored. Vertil insists, explaining that a high-ranking paladin is demanding an answer. Reluctantly, Lonius replies that his wife is named Marcia and his daughter is Mina. Satisfied, his superior notes that they'll be traveling for a few days and jokes that he was planning to tease Lonius if he started calling out his wife's or daughter's name in his sleep. But unbothered by the mockery, Lonius thinks to himself that while this guy is extremely rude and annoying, on the other hand, his skills are fantastic. In any case, Vertil is annoyed to be sent to the Dark Continent, but Lonius explains it's because they need to investigate a revelation Saint Soalina received. Vertil complains that their unit is far too small for something so delicate, since it's just the two of them and they've been told to fill out the rest of the party with mercenaries. Lonius agrees it's rare for them to investigate outside their borders, so clearly, there must be a reason they forced Vertil to join him just before departure. As they leave, the pair runs into a group of soldiers who salute Chief Lonius. Vertil assumes his partner must have hired these mercenaries and suddenly gets much more motivated. Lonius considers that, despite Vertil's attitude, he's still a high-ranking paladin, which will definitely boost the team's chances of survival. Back in Minogra, things seem to be going smoothly. Takuto watches the whole process unfold, his eyes filled with joy and hope. He's seen his civilization get started in the game countless times before, but now he gets to witness it firsthand, as if it were real life. And that's just incredible. Soon after, he and Atu are taken by Emil to visit the nation's residential area. According to their guide, the Dark Elves are experts at building homes in the treetops, but since they've been prioritizing the meat trees, not many houses have been built yet. At least the food trees are growing well, and the food storehouse should be finished soon. Emil also mentions that, at the Institute of Magical Research, Elder Molter is gathering those with magical talent to kick off new research. Takuto is pleased with his subordinates' initiative and resourcefulness. And most importantly, the Dark Elves, who were once so thin and exhausted, are now full of life. Emil, a little anxious, asks what the king thinks of all this, since they've all been working so hard to repay the mercy he's shown them. Takuto assures her he thinks it's all amazing and says he's happy to welcome the Dark Elves as citizens. And she, realizing she's been recognized for her hard work, starts to cry with joy. After composing herself, she points out that the meat trees are almost ready for harvest, all thanks to the agricultural tools the king provided. With a haunting voice, one of the trees claims its fruit is almost ripe enough to eat, sending shivers down Emil's spine, while Atu, thrilled, celebrates that they've finally secured enough food. Emil then wants to show them the water source she'd mentioned, but on the way, she senses something strange in the forest, and her suspicions are confirmed when they reach the water. Gia and Molter arrive soon after, but Emil reveals that, unfortunately, the water is no longer good. Molter examines the color and agrees, but Atu takes a sip and declares it's perfectly fine. The Dark Elves are taken aback, but she reminds them, this place is known as the Cursed Lands, and this is proof that the area has truly become part of Minogra's domain. Takuto asks the elves to take a deep breath, and as they do, they feel their minds become sharper and their bodies noticeably stronger. Atu says the Cursed Lands benefit evil beings, while harming those who are neutral or good. Hearing this, Gia drinks the water and finds nothing wrong with it. Takuto points out that this conquered territory is perfect for defense, and soon, all of Minogra's land will be the same. Grateful for the king's immense power, Elder Molter notes that the only downside is that this transformation makes it easier for enemies to spot Minogra's territory. Once again, Gia insists they need to form an army. Unfazed, Atu reminds everyone that they'll be creating a hero, to which Molter admits, with some confusion, that he has no idea what that means. And well, sometimes actions speak louder than words, so the elf thought it would be easier to show what she meant. At that moment, magical, shadowy tentacles shoot out from her back, slicing through the trees behind her as if they were razors. After that visceral demonstration, the elf revealed that she herself was a hero and that what they had just seen was nothing compared to what she could do at her peak. In other words, heroes have the power to wipe out entire armies on their own. Takuto explained that heroes only get stronger over time, even if they barely lift a finger. So, as long as they can stay isolated, Atu alone would be enough to defend the nation for now. Still, after his subordinate's little demonstration, the king couldn't help but complain that she didn't need to cut down half the forest just to prove a point. Once again, the sheer power of King Takuto and Thalamacenta left the Dark Elves awestruck, completely won over. They vow to build a palace worthy of their king as soon as possible. Honestly, Takuto didn't much care for the idea of living in a palace, but the Dark Elves, however, were scandalized by the thought. The idea that the supreme ruler would settle for the same standard as his people filled them with guilt. As Takuto scratched his head, his friend pointed out that building a palace would be expensive, but it could also generate resources and would boost the citizens' happiness. With that, Takuto admitted that, once upon a time, he'd actually wanted a floating castle, so maybe having a palace wouldn't be so bad after all. The Dark Elves were fascinated by the idea of a palace soaring through the sky, something that not long ago would have seemed completely impossible. But after everything they'd witnessed, they were starting to believe that, with their king, even a flying city might one day exist. Once more, the elves fell to their knees and swore to serve their lord with all they had, praying for Minogra's eternal prosperity. Our protag, for his part, was visibly embarrassed by all the attention, but since everyone seemed motivated, he encouraged them to keep up the pace and continue building the nation. The scene changes, and we see that while Minogra is growing, the paladins are on their way, and everything points to a clash being inevitable in the future. Meanwhile, after gathering the expedition team, Verdel praises Lonius for managing to round up so many mercenaries, especially considering that most of them are up north, dealing with the northern disturbance. This whole mess started when barbarians suddenly appeared in the northern province of the Holy Empire of Qualia, raiding villages and causing massive damage. The Saint and the Imperial Army were sent to deal with the chaos, but things are still far from under control. And as a mercenary named Bargo cracks a sly smile talking about the situation, Lonius quickly cuts him off, telling him not to act like it's not his problem. But the mercenary just shrugs it off, insisting that either way, it's not his problem. Surprised, Verdel asks if his crew doesn't plan on heading north. Considering the huge payout they're offering, Bargo explains that nobody's willing to risk their necks after rumors confirmed there's a witch involved in the conflict. In any case, Verdel closes the subject, reminding everyone that their path lies south, into the cursed lands, where nobody knows what they'll find. Meanwhile, deep within the cursed lands, a ghostly figure prowls the shadowy forest, its face hidden beneath a hood. As night falls, the group settles in at a tavern. Lonius brings up the witch from earlier, curious if the rumors are true. But the mercenary dismisses it, saying it's just gossip and that people love to blame the chaos up north on some kind of monster. The paladin agrees, calling it ridiculous, especially since the saint herself is on the case. Bargo says the rumor was probably cooked up by heretics, but just as he's about to continue, Verdel tells him to stop. By this point, the paladin is clearly drunk and calls for another round, leading Bargo to ask if he hasn't had enough. Verdel replies, "After tending to the suffering of the people, in your own home, before your family, you may lay aside your sacred vestments." In other words, when the day's work is done, there's nothing wrong with relaxing a little. Lonius, knowing the scriptures inside and out, corrects him, pointing out that the holy god Arlos only meant that we're excused from our sacred duties when we're around family, not that it's an excuse to get wasted. Unfazed, Verdel says he's ready for a good old religious debate. But at that exact moment, the waitress arrives with another mug the size of a bucket, which makes the conversation change course. Bargo, meanwhile, gets back to business. He points out that two paladins are going out of their way to investigate the cursed lands of the Black Continent, and he wants to know what's so important down there. Because if it's something like a witch, he and his men are out. Verdel assures him that's not the case. In fact, it's about dark elves who fled to those lands, and the Qualian authorities are worried they might stir up trouble. Bargo nods, understanding. That race of elf is infamous for assassinations and curses. Lonius adds that they could become a threat if they get stronger in secret. But Verdel tells him not to stress, they're just there to investigate this time. And if things go south, they can just bail, which Bargo is relieved to hear, as bailing seems to be his specialty. But the other paladin questions if that's really how a warrior of God should act, since they swore to lay down their lives to fight evil. His colleague counters that seeking glory isn't always the point, and that sometimes, you have to take one step back to take two steps forward. After all, everyone here has family waiting for them, and that's reason enough to be careful before diving headlong into danger. And I gotta say, I agree with this guy. That said, the paladin finds himself wondering when he became the old drunk who gives everyone advice. But leaving that aside, he raises his mug and proposes a toast to the expedition. With a deep sigh, Lonius clutches his ring and asks the holy god Arlos to watch over them all. Meanwhile, on the Black Continent, our King Takuto gathers the elves for an event that none of them quite understand. He piles up a mountain of fruits from the meat tree and casts a spell over it, slowly transforming the heap into a long-legged insect. Elder Molter is shocked, as he never imagined the king could create new life. Atu takes the chance to give a proud speech about the incomparable power of the King of Ruin, pointing out that this is just a small sample of what he's truly capable of. Therefore, if the people of Minogra remain dedicated and happy, it will awaken the king's full potential. In other words, it's everyone's duty to show their absolute devotion to Master Takuto. When the crowd disperses, our protag seems relieved that the ritual went smoothly. They're surprised at how easy it was to gather the necessary resources. But what's even more important now is that they know they can create new units. Which means next time, they'll be able to attempt a hero summoning, though they'll need to build up more mana first. Still, with two heroes, they'll have much more confidence in their military strength. Excited, Atu asks him who he'll summon first, and without a moment's hesitation he answers, Isla, the Queen of Insects. One of Minogra's proud heroines, capable of strengthening all insect units, turning long-legged insects into frontline fighters, and producing larvae to boost the nation. In short, Isla is invaluable both in battle and in domestic affairs, making her the perfect hero for this early stage. Leaving that aside, and this is clearly the most important strategic issue, Takuto remembers that the other heroes have terrible personalities. Atu agrees, since the rest are a bunch of egotistical maniacs and depraved lunatics, every one of them obsessed with world domination. Takuto clarifies that he's not saying he'll never summon those types, just that he'd rather avoid it for now, as his main priority is to find a little peace. The next day, as night was approaching, the expedition group led by the two paladins of Qualia ran into a hill giant. Lonius expected nothing less from the Black Continent. He ordered the mercenaries to ready their bows, but Verdel took responsibility for this fight, as there was no time to waste. Stepping forward alone, he drew his weapon and began a prayer, channeling the sacred sword art. And while Bargo was visibly confused, Lonius explained that this was Qualia's secret technique, weaving prayers into his swordplay to invoke divine power. Meanwhile, Verdel was attacked by the giant's enormous club but managed to slice the weapon in two with his blessed sword. Lonius added that paladins who received divine power had their physical abilities greatly enhanced. After a series of rapid strikes, Verdel landed a direct blow to the giant's chest, tearing it apart. According to Lonius, for a high-ranking paladin, this level of power was on par with a lesser dragon. In other words, monsters like the one they just faced stood no chance. And when Verdel finished off the enemy, the mercenaries were left speechless. Atu wondered if the king was worried about the neighboring city, since it wasn't part of Qualia, which meant its alignment wasn't necessarily good. Therefore, it would be wise to decide how to handle it, since, being the closest, they'd probably be the first to discover Minogra's existence. Takuto was actually happy they were neutral. If they were good, negotiations would be impossible. But his assistant knew all too well that being optimistic about a potential threat was basically asking for a disaster. And well, speaking of disaster, at that exact moment, the king sensed an armed group approaching the forest. Not wanting to attract attention, he ordered her to drive them away as peacefully as possible. But if that wasn't an option, she was free to do whatever was necessary. The scene changes, and we see that at the entrance to the Cursed Lands, the mercenary group was preparing to enter under the leadership of the two paladins of Qualia. But just as they neared the edge of the forest, a woman appeared. Verdel demanded to know who she was. The young woman introduced herself as a dark elf who had fled to the forest to survive. She asked what brought the paladins of Qualia there, but Verdel refused to reveal their purpose, questioning her presence. She replied simply that she was living with others who had gone through similar hardships. The elf urged them to turn back. Lonius tried to insert himself, insisting they were men recognized by God, but Verdel quickly shut him down. After all, he was the one talking now. The younger paladin insisted he couldn't just turn back and leave, but she pleaded for mercy, explaining that her people were terrified. Seeing how persistent she was, Verdel wondered if there was something hidden in the forest, something she assured him was nothing but peace and quiet. Finally, Verdel lays it all on the line. They were there because of a divine revelation warning of a calamity in the area, and they couldn't leave without confirming what was really going on. Lonius, shocked, reminded him that this was supposed to be a state secret, but Verdel told him to shut his trap once more. However, even after learning about the revelation, the dark elf refused to let the paladins enter. With her crimson eyes glowing, she insisted there was nothing to fear and that the paladins should return to where they came from. Lonius suspected she was using dark magic and became even more convinced there was a calamity nearby. Verdel, on the other hand, seemed to be falling under her spell, almost ready to call off the mission. So, he asked the elf to swear before God that there was nothing wrong with the forest. And when she did, he decided they would leave. Lonius couldn't believe his companion was buying this, but the other paladin truly believed these elves just wanted to live in peace. Lonius insists he can feel the evil energy radiating from her and that there's no way someone like that can be trusted, but his companion reminds him that trust is one of the pillars of their faith. Raising his voice, Verdel yells that there is nothing wrong with this forest and that this is simply the conclusion of their investigation. With that, the man turns to leave. Lonius, who is making me incredibly angry, says that Verdel is abandoning the mission and relieves him of command right then and there. Verdel turns around, demanding to know what he thinks he's doing. The younger paladin argues that he not only revealed the prophecy but is now about to leave without even investigating. From now on, Lonius proclaims, he's taking charge, and the investigation will proceed right now. Bargo responds to the call as if Lonius really is the leader. Verdel reprimands him, but the mercenary chief explains that it's Lonius who's paying his group. The elf pleads with them to reconsider, but Lonius orders his men to restrain her. On the other hand, Verdel commands that no one lay a finger on someone so defenseless. So, realizing her attempts to resolve things peacefully have unfortunately failed, Atu decides she has no alternative and will have to take another approach. And well, in a scene change we see what that other approach was. Lonius wakes up, with blood on his hands. As he takes in the tragedy that unfolded around him, he sees Verdel standing before a witch, the very creature responsible for slaughtering the mercenaries in such a brutal fashion. Atu, for her part, laments that things were going so well, but sadly, not everything in life goes as planned.
Verdel, anxious, tells Bargo to make sure one of the messengers gets back home to report what just happened. But the mercenary replies that's not going to be possible, because Atu simply barbecued all their messengers with a single attack. And as he says this, we see the elf is brimming with confidence. She tells them not to be scared now. After all, she's exactly the kind of monster they were looking for. The soldiers' bodies drop to the ground, and Lonius is petrified with fear. However, Verdel still stands firm and tells them not to lose their cool, because it's either they die now or they fight to the end. With that, he orders everyone to take their combat positions. But our dear Atu doesn't seem the slightest bit intimidated. In fact, she finds this whole thing kind of amusing. Verdel then orders them to fire their arrows, and we see a shower of projectiles fly towards Atu, but she blocks every single one effortlessly with her tentacles, and this shatters the morale of Verdel, Lonius, and the others. Verdel then laments that everything was going so well. Atu agrees, mentioning that when you get down to it, the blame lies solely and exclusively with the bowl-cut idiot, since he was the one who kept up with that bossy and challenging charade. Lonius then questions what a witch like Atu is and what she's capable of. Verdel admits he was instructed to keep that information confidential, but since he thinks he's going to die anyway, it wouldn't make a difference. It turns out that when a saint receives a revelation and the higher-ups confirm it, that monster is then classified as a witch, and he has strong reasons to believe the woman before them is that very same being. Lonius hears the explanation and understands that they're both completely screwed. Atu then asks if they're done catching up on the gossip because she's about to finish them off. Verdel isn't willing to back down and tells the mercenaries to fall back, as he and Lonius will handle this mess. With that, the two of them charge forward with their swords in hand and make contact with Atu's tentacles. She smiles, saying they're much slower and weaker than she expected. However, things take an unexpected turn when they both manage to cut through her tentacles, something Atu herself can't believe just happened. After Lonius and Verdel create some distance, they conclude that their plan will be, first and foremost, to cut off her disgusting tentacles. But Atu doesn't panic. Instead, she strangely starts to caress the tentacle that was cut off. Verdel interrupts this with a strike that cuts off another of her tentacles, and Lonius follows up and cuts another, which makes Atu finally start to sweat. She now has only 2 tentacles left and uses them to take 2 of the paladins hostage, admitting that she might have underestimated them a bit and that they've proven to be much stronger than she thought. She knows full well how much humans care for each other, so she's planning on using these paladins as meat shields, perfectly aware that Verdel and Lonius won't attack. Verdel tells Lonius to keep us cool and think about the bigger picture. If they sacrifice these 2 paladins and defeat her, their victory would mean an end to all of this once and for all. They charge forward simultaneously to deliver the final blow. The elf is shocked to see them willing to attack, knowing it would mean killing 2 of their soldiers. And so they did, running their swords through the soldiers and are about to land a decisive strike. But that's when Atu decides to stop playing around. And as a consequence, we see Lonius open his eyes and find himself still alive on the floor. But as for Verdel, let's just say luck didn't smile on him. Atu did, and he bit the dust. Lonius, seeing this, doesn't understand what's happening because they had already cut off all her tentacles. She informs him that she can regenerate them as much as she wants. In other words, she was literally toying with them from the start. Lonius has no more tricks up his sleeve, so he just tells the other paladins to get out of there as fast as they can, as at least one person has to make it back alive to warn the kingdom. Hearing that order, the paladins bail, and as a last desperate effort, Lonius tries a sneak attack, but she easily blocks it, drawing a sword of her own. Lonius trembles in shock, wondering how she's able to use the sacred sword art. Atu playfully swings the sword around while saying she absorbed both the sword and the techniques from Verdel, and all the effort and techniques he honed became hers the moment she took him out. The elf isn't surprised that Verdel was high-ranking paladin since he was concerned for everyone's safety until his final moment, but it's so sad that he ended up being killed because that blockhead over there couldn't keep his mouth shut. They then exchange a few more blows until the elf asks if he still wants to see his wife, Marcia, and his daughter Mina again. And Lonius almost craps his pants hearing that. After all, how could she know about his family? It's then that he realizes Atu also obtained Verdel's feelings and memories after finishing him off, and consequently she gets stronger after defeating each enemy. Hearing those names, the fear that was already in his eyes becomes absolutely overwhelming. Atu reveals that Verdel thought of his comrade's safety until his last breath, exactly what a paladin, a true hero, should do. But she emphasizes once again that it was all in vain because of the blockhead gentleman's misguided courage and his need to follow stupid rules. Trying not to be shaken, Lonius says that Verdel's will and hope will live on as long as the mercenaries manage to escape, but as soon as he says this, he hears the scream of a mercenary echoing in the distance. The elf reveals she has her own allies and positioned them to prevent any survivors from escaping. At that moment, my friends, whatever hope Lonius had seems to slip through his fingers, leaving only total and absolute despair behind. In the next scene, as the sun begins to set, the elf talks to her opponent about how things could have been different if only Lonius had listened to Verdel. He could have returned to his beloved family, living a quiet and peaceful life. But now it's time to talk about what's really going to happen. The future Lonius chose. The paladin is going to bite the dust, and she warns that his family will too, as she's going to hunt down his wife and daughter, torturing them so mercilessly that both will beg for death. And after that, the elf will visit every village and town they pass through, exterminating every living soul, just because she can. And when people ask why, she'll simply say it's all Lonius's fault. Damn, that's what we call pacifism, huh? Lonius, desperate, tells her to stop, but Atu continues, sharing a lesson she learned from someone precious. When you're underestimated, it will be your end. So when that happens, you kill, no matter what. That's why she'll do what she'll do, precisely to ensure she's never underestimated again. And that it doesn't matter if it's hundreds, thousands, or even millions, she'll wipe them all off the map. And to make it crystal clear, she stresses once more that it's all because of Lonius's decision. As our not-so-dear Atu flashes the smile of a deep-web pacifist, the man starts to cry and begs her not to do it. But she continues, saying she knows Lonius was probably a good man who believed in God and always tried to do the right thing. But that's exactly why she despises those who think they're righteous. And with that, she says goodbye to the paladin and tells him to watch the true meaning of calamity while enjoying his VIP seat up in heaven. Hearing these words, Lonius lets out a scream of despair until finally his physical and psychological torture comes to an end. When it's all over, we see Gia show up and report that the fleeing humans have been taken care of, and the elf then announces she's going back to the forest. However, before she leaves, Gia asks her if she's really going to do all those terrible things she threatened, and she just laughs and says she'd never do that. After all, she's a pacifist. She was just having a little fun teasing him to lighten the mood. And still, she can't waste time. She needs to get back to the king. A joke, yeah, right. She goes to Takuto and reveals that there are witches in this world, a unit that doesn't exist in the original universe of the game Eternal Nations, which means this isn't the world of the game, but some kind of parallel version. Takuto is frustrated knowing this will only complicate Minagraha's plans, but she points out there's an upside. Besides her ability to steal powers, she can now also steal fragments of memories. Takuto, excited, notes this will help them find out what's happening in Qualia without needing a full-blown investigation. The elf reports that Qualia isn't as strong as they thought, thanks to the northern province and a disaster that happened there. Because of that, the king feels that Minagraha has bought a little more time with this stalemate. In other words, this isn't a concern for now. However, what really worries our protag in this whole story is the cause of that disaster. According to the memories Atu stole, it's being attributed to a witch, and apparently this monstrous being is called Irakino, the Devouring Witch. The scene changes and we see who this Irakino is, skipping and humming happily among the rubble and victims of the calamity she herself unleashed, mimicking the tick-tock of a clock. And her plan now is to go to the next city and bring chaos there as well. We return to Minagraha, and Takuto theorizes that this witch might have come to this world the same way they did. But leaving the guesswork aside, they need to focus on the here and now, which means preparing and getting stronger. Because considering this witch is a hero unit, Takuto had initially thought of summoning Ayla, But considering she's a unit better suited for resource production than for combat, and understanding that the scenario has changed with the information they've obtained, the king is considering summoning another hero, that one that's enough to stand up to the witch. Furthermore, Takuto mentions that Ayla isn't the only thing he needs to reconsider. When the elf asks what else, he says he's thinking of forging an alliance, which sends a chill down Atu's spine, activating her suspicious mode. Takuto then explains, saying they have a known enemy in Quoglia, plus the uncertain element that is the witch. Knowing this, he wants to have at least one more nation on their side. Atu says he understands his reasoning, but questions how that could be possible since they are aligned with evil. Takuto replies that it is possible as long as the other side has something to gain, and that it will only work if the nation in question is neutral. Atu, listening intently, asks if he's talking about the nation to the east. Takuto says yes, and that when the palace is ready, he wants to investigate that nation and at the same time strengthen Minograha's forces, to see if they're willing to join forces. Far from all this, we see another scene where a staff bearer orders the elders to be taken down from their pedestal and tells her followers to take care of the bodies. However, it seems things there are far from over, as more enemies appear. She orders the fighters to take a defensive position, and furthermore, she sends messengers to ask for reinforcements. And from the way this story is unfolding, maybe this is the nation that will end up allying with Minograha. After all, wherever there are tears, there will always be someone to sell a handkerchief, right? Since they need reinforcements and Minograha needs allies, this would be the mutual aid that would benefit both. Back to our protag, we see that Atu is worried, as she thinks Takuto might have thought her actions went a bit too far against the paladins.
However, contrary to what she expected, she realizes that the madman in front of her is totally chill, assuring that he would never be offended by anything his assistant did, as all he wants is for her to keep supporting him. And hearing these words, the elf melts and gets emotional, promising that she will stand by the king no matter what happens.
Shortly after, two young elf girls emerge from the forest, walking towards the still under construction city of Minogra, while wondering why the hell they're still alive. And as they question the reason for their existence, we then see that our protag's royal palace has finally been completed. Well, according to Atu, they still had a ton of problems to deal with, but at least that building signified the true beginning of their world. Thrilled to be sitting on his throne, Takuto was already planning to expand the palace as soon as they had time. Excited by the idea, Atu commented that the palace should pierce the skies and sink its roots deep into the earth. However, in the midst of so much happiness, she realized something. The elf noticed they didn't have a single servant to attend to her master, and for her at least, this was a gigantic failure in her management. Takuto tried to smooth things over, saying he was super chill with it, but the elf took it dramatically, acting as if it bothered her 10 times more than it did him, and insisted that the king choose his attendant immediately. Takuto then thinks for a bit and mentions that he'd love for it to be someone easy to talk to, since communication was one of his biggest weaknesses. He says he'd like to be a more approachable king, but he could barely hold a decent conversation with the Dark Elves. Hearing this, Atu then had a brilliant idea and asked for some time. And well, instead of feeling hopeful, our protag just thought that nothing good ever came from this girl getting excited about something. The scene evolved, and we then see that Moltar, Gia, and Emily have arrived as they were summoned by Atu, and she, without giving many details, ordered Moltar to gather all the little girls to satisfy the king's wish. Dudes, check out the ideas on La Macenta. And Moltar, just like me and also our protag, was shocked by the way this was put. But amidst the chaos, Atu explained that her plan was to have the girls serve as Takuto's attendants so he could practice conversation, and things kinda started to line up. And Takuto, outraged by the impression the elf was giving, quickly explained what he really wanted. From what Moltar understood, Takuto wished to have innocent children around so he wouldn't feel bound by conventional thinking when speaking. Relieved, Gia observed that children often had ridiculous ideas, but that sometimes those ideas could spark revelations in adults. Nervously, Atu added another reason. The king wanted to avoid pulling too many adults from the workforce, so the attendants would only handle mundane tasks.
Gia retorted that a boy could do that too, but Takuto quickly argued that they had to be girls because of future leadership, as he intended to give more women the opportunity to study for the good of the nation. Hearing this, the Dark Elves were stunned by their leader's wisdom, leaving Takuto relieved that his desperate excuse had actually worked.
The reality, however, was nothing like he had imagined, because the moment the little girls arrived, they obviously started bawling their eyes out in fear. And while the poor guy twisted in frustration, the elf explained that this was normal, though she didn't hesitate to scold Moltar for bringing crybabies. The elder apologized, but unfortunately those were all the girls in the kingdom. While Akundi grumbled, Gia asked if the elder had at least allowed the twins to come. Stammering, the old man admitted he hadn't, as it would be very disrespectful in his view. Akundi, hearing this, wanted to know why, and Moltar explained that there was a pair of orphaned twins who were well behaved, but he believed they were not suitable to serve the king. Not wanting to get into details and fed up with the crying, Akundi ordered them to bring the twins anyway. Gia then mentioned that he had already anticipated this because, unlike the elder, he was a sharp young man who always thought 2 steps ahead, much to the king's delight. And so the twins were brought to Takuto. Immediately, the younger one, with short hair, politely introduced herself as Karya Elfer, while the older one was named Maria. For some reason, Akundi suspected they had a dark past, so she asked Karya about the marks on her body, to which the girl sadly replied that it was from an illness, which made the king feel sorry for her. Curiously, Karya believed she deserved it, and the elder intervened to clarify that they were scars left by a plague. The elf then asked about the older sister's past, and Karya revealed that something cruel had happened to her. At that moment, Maria herself explained, saying she ate her own mother. And damn, this episode is bringing up some heavy topics, don't you think? So true, in fact, that her shocking statement made Akundi demand answers from the elder. He explained that their mother was a proud woman and that the clan would never forget the sacrifice she made for everyone. With those words, our protag figured out what happened, as this clan faced hardships where they had it rougher than rough after their exile, and as a consequence, hunger forced them to make equally extreme decisions.
Suddenly, Maria stepped forward and observed that the king didn't seem to have the color he possessed. Our protag asked what she meant, but not even the girl knew how to explain. Regardless, the sovereign asked if she was willing to take care of him, and she answered yes, smiling. With that, the King of Ruin declared that from that day forward, Maria Elfer was a candidate for leadership in Mainagra. Eito was astonished that the king was having such a normal conversation with a little girl, and the king asked Karya if she wasn't afraid, to which she replied that her duty was to be by her older sister's side. That night, Moltar returned to the palace to share something he deemed important, mentioning that the twins hadn't cried even once since losing their mother. With hearts so closed off, the elder asked the king to treat them with patience and compassion. A few days later, the two were working hard. One morning, Maria spilled a glass of water onto Kuto, and Karya rushed to dry him off. The scene then changed, and we move on to a meeting where Eito initiated the discussion on domestic affairs. Emily, who is the head of construction, reported that the timber stock was stable and the kingdom's resources were in good shape, enough to start a new facility, a clinic. Takuto reflected that a clinic would protect the citizens' health at a relatively low cost. Emily also reported that the internal gathering of food and materials was going well, but the process of creating goods consumed a lot of mana, and the balance wasn't great. Moltar, who is the head of research, took the floor and announced that the research on military magic had been successfully completed. However, for the time being, only he could use it, but with training, his subordinates would soon master it. Eito ordered the planning to move forward, officially initiating research on the 6 core elements of magical technology. Finally, Gia reported that the army had acquired 5 new longlegs, which were currently surveying the uncharted territories. The objective was to remain discreet, so bold investigations were out of the question. After that, Eito also announced to them the production of a new hero from Mainagra, Isla, the Queen of Insects. The name made the Dark Elves uncomfortable, but Lamacenta ignored their concerns. And well, a few hours later, with everyone looking completely wiped, the meeting ended and the king decreed that everything agreed upon should begin immediately. Upon leaving the meeting, Maria accidentally bumped into the king, dropping the stack of papers she was carrying. As the sisters gathered the papers, they ended up tearing a sheet while grabbing it at the same time. Seeing this, Takuto again showed patience, assuring them it was okay. As he sat on the throne, Maria suddenly asked if he was a bad person, to which he replied that his alignment was, in fact, evil. Hearing this, she pressed him on why he hadn't killed them yet. Horrified, Carrie rushed to explain that her older sister just wanted to understand why the leader showed them so much mercy, because according to her, Maria was upset that someone evil could be so kind. Faced with their confusion about these concepts, our protag tried to clarify, saying that a good person can only do what is right. However, the beauty of being evil isn't just about practicing evil, but about being able to do whatever you want, be it good or bad. He continues, saying that being evil meant being selfish enough to be free to follow your own sense of right, without caring what others think. In other words, kindness in his case isn't a social obligation, but a choice. Carrie shouted that it wasn't fair, while Maria asked if he wouldn't be punished for it. He replied that if he killed the good person who came to punish him first, then no, he wouldn't be. He then asked if their mistakes so far had been intentional, and they admitted they had. And when he asked if they feared death, they nodded. He concluded that they couldn't forgive themselves for having survived at the cost of their mother's life, and so they sought redemption in death. Considering this, he explained that they are alive because their mother's love triumphed over fate. He acknowledges how painful her choice was, but that's what gave the two girls the chance to still be here, and for that they should be proud. And in return for their mother's sacrifice based on her love, they should live their lives as they wish, so they could make their mother, who allowed them to live, proud. Hearing this attentively, the two gave in and began to cry non-stop. Sometime later, Atu arrives to inform the king that the city they were investigating is called Dragonton, part of Forangon, a neutral country inhabited by humans and beast people. She reports that Dragonton has a dragon vein mine, a powerful source of mana that, if possible, should be controlled by Minogra. Currently, she reports that Dragonton is on high alert due to attacks by goblins and ogres. In other words, if Minogra were to take in the war refugees, this would be a great opportunity to both increase its population and gain influence in the region. With this in mind, our boy Takuto orders that diplomats be sent to Forangon. And with that, the episode ends. So, what did you guys think of our King Takuto's philosophy? And how do you think this diplomacy with the city of Dragonton will go? If you want the continuation, let me know in the comments that you want the next part, smash that like button and the hype to support this video, and subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next parts.
Sometime later, Atu and her delegation meet a delegation from Dragonton, and their dark aura sends shivers down the local spines. Terrified, one of the warriors at Tonokapoli's side almost loses control, until the leader quickly orders her men to restrain their instincts. Atu tells her subordinates to fall back and remain on alert, while the envoy from Dragonton grows increasingly tense with the heavy atmosphere settling in the air. Suddenly, young Pippis steps forward and insists on handling the situation. Showing a lot of charisma, he greets the sinister beings and asks for their names. Atu quickly hides her tentacles, while Tonokapoli burns with rage at the brat's boldness. Once tempers settle, the elf walks alongside the cow woman in the forest, surprised to learn that she too has sought an audience with the King of Ruin, especially since Minogata had just sent a delegation to Dragonton. Pippe confirms that this was the very reason they bumped into each other by chance along the way. Showing a lot of excitement, he begins to tell the stories of their adventures to get there. Tonokapoli then apologizes for the chatterbox, while Atu changes the subject, asking if it was okay for them to leave their soldiers behind. She explains that yes, the miasma from the Dark Elves is far too strong for her men to endure, so she ordered them to wait outside. However, what she doesn't reveal is the real reason. They're about to meet the king himself, and no one knows what to expect. In other words, you can't be too careful. Hours later, standing before the dreaded ruler of Minogata, Tonokapoli grips her staff tightly as the aura radiating from this being is so overwhelming that she can barely comprehend the true extent of his power. With such a presence now looming near her city, the leader of Dragonton bitterly regrets a choice that has backfired on her. But before all this started, long before encountering Minogata's delegation, we get a flashback. We see that Pippe had defeated a giant using his plant arm magic, probably declaring the area safe. While he was there demanding more applause, the giant broke free from its leafy prison and attacked again, making Tonokapoli combine her plant arm magic with her swamp spell, tightening the giant's restraints. With the enemy completely tamed, so to speak,
The sorceress ordered the warriors to finish it off. After the battle, she broke her staff over Pippe's head when he dared call her grandma. After all, she was still a young and healthy woman of only 240 years old. Besides, as the only youth in the city to wield a staff, the boy ought to act like a leader instead of clowning around. To be honest, the seasoned mage worried about his future, especially now that they were about to venture into the cursed lands. Pippe, who hadn't even realized that was the plan, got another scolding for his ignorance. She reminded him that the elders saw signs of an impending apocalypse emanating from that place and ordered them to investigate. Especially because if the barbarian attacks on Dragonton continued, the city would eventually fall. Their survival depended on discovering the cause of the attacks inside the cursed lands before it was too late. Lost in her thoughts, she was startled when Pippe introduced himself cheerfully to Takuto with that contagious, childlike aura, inviting the king to be his friend. Horrified, the mage ran to beg for forgiveness from the nation's leader. However, our protag smiled, accepted the boy's offer, and assured everyone they would get along well. Atula Macenta, who until then wore a stern expression, clapped along with the dark elves to celebrate her king's first friendship. To mark the occasion, a banquet was held. Tonokapoli, upon tasting a drink, was enchanted by its unique flavor. Seeing her delighted expression, Atu proudly proclaimed that her nation produced the most delicious beverage in the world. The cow woman admitted she never expected to taste something so wonderful there. Curious, Pippe asked what the drink was, and Maria explained it was apple juice. In that instant, Tonokapoli knew trouble was about to start, and she was right. Pippe jumped from his chair, pestering the guests, complimenting Gia's muscles and showing off his magic to Maltar. Observing all this, Takuto thought about how remarkable the boy's social skills were, recognizing he could never blend in so easily. At the same time, our protag was at a loss since Pippe was his first friend and he had no idea how to handle it, given his terrible communication skills. To complicate things, Minogata was in delicate negotiations and he needed to prove they weren't a hostile nation. With all this in mind, he called Pippe over and asked if he'd like to play a game. The sudden proposal made the entire banquet tense up, until Pippe, of course, simply smiled and joyfully agreed. And so the two sat at a table surrounded by various game boards. The king seemed delighted with a child's company, until Pippe praised the apple juice and the fun games, declaring he was happy to have come. In fact, he even suggested they sell the juice to his country, as he was sure they would love it. And while Tonokapoli was about to tear out the hair she didn't even have, Takuto recognized the opportunity. In the end, after the banquet, Pippe stuffed himself until he couldn't anymore, only to get another whack on the head from his countrywoman for getting a little too full of himself. Atto then asked the woman why they had come to Minogata, a question that once again raised attention. A bit hesitant, the cowwoman admitted that her country had been under attack by barbarians. This was unusual, but Tonokapoli explained that since the attacks were happening on a massive scale, her nation decided to investigate. Takuto asked if Dragonton lacked military power, and the question made Tonokapoli even more anxious. She quickly assured them they were capable of repelling the threat, but emphasized that prevention was always better. Then Pippe spilled the beans, questioning if they hadn't come there to investigate and find a way to not get smashed by the enemies. The comment made Tonokapoli so nervous she almost left her body, and Atto just sympathized as she understands the randomness of airheads. Lamacenta then reassured her, saying that Minogara had no intentions of harming Forngon. With an innocent smile, the elf admitted that Minogara was a domain of evil that loved peace, and besides, if Dragonton were to fall, Minogara would certainly be the Horde's next target. In other words, the matter concerned them directly as well. Eager for military aid, Tonokapoli reflected that Minogata's willingness to help probably had to do with the Dragonvein mine, but with her city's existence on the line, all she could do was play the game. Takuto replied that friends should help one another, and since Pippe's blunder put Dragonton in a delicate spot, Tonokapoli asked what they wanted in return. Atu immediately mentioned the mine, which left the cowwoman visibly shaken. The elf clarified that Minogata had no problem co-managing the mine with Dragonton, but they wanted the right to choose which element the raw energy would be converted into. Tonokapoli pointed out that this was a technology that would take at least 10 years to develop, but if they mentioned it, maybe Minogara had already made the breakthrough. Faced with this twist, the spokesperson for Dragonton declared that Pepe was an idiot, probably the biggest fool Forngon had ever seen. Even so, he was still the nation's future, and Pepe had a special gift. He could sense the nature of people. Therefore, the sorceress encouraged him to make the decision. Smiling, Pepe simply declared that what he most wanted was the friendship between Minogara and Forngon. In the next scene, Minogara's leaders gathered to review the agreements. Emil recalled that they had agreed to export provisions and toys in exchange for daily necessities and metal goods. For Moltar, it was a relief to secure these items without depending on the king. Atu celebrated that the greatest prize of all was access to the Dragon Vein mine. The elder observed that they had gained an advantage thanks to Pippa's screw-up, something that he agreed with, although deep down he thought that if it weren't for the boy, the friendship between the two nations might not have emerged so easily. The King of Ruin even wondered if the child had revealed Dragonton's weakness on purpose. Returning to the matter at hand, Atu raised the issue of future relations. Since no one knew anything about Forngon, Moltar insisted that learning their customs would be crucial. The problem was that their capital, Lua Crescent, was too far away. Because of that, it would have to wait. Takuto then ordered that aid to Dragonton be prioritized, while Moltar reminded them that they would need some formal pretext to enter another nation. The council suggested sending Maria and Karia, who didn't have official positions yet but were deeply trusted. Takuto obviously worried, but Moltar reminded him that both were being trained as future leaders, so this would be their first chance to gain real experience. Even so, when the king still showed concern, Atu offered to accompany them, but Moltar argued that wasn't wise since she was Takuto's most close confidant. Hearing these words, the young elf was enchanted. In the end, Karia remembers something Takuto once told them: they are free. Thinking about the freedom they have, they decide that they want to be useful to their master. In other words, they are willing to run whatever risks await them in Forngon. After much insistence from the girls, Takuto finally gives in. And Atu is shocked and even a little jealous that he gave in to the persuasive pleas of other people. At that moment, Emil suggests that it would be madness to send just the two young women alone, but the king has someone in mind to escort them. After the meeting, Takuto settles onto his throne. We see that Atu is still consumed by jealousy, and when our protag doesn't know what to do, the two girls advise him to just say what he's thinking. With that in mind, Takuto approaches his most loyal aide and thanks her for always thinking of him, mentioning that he always knew he only got this far because she was by his side. That's why he makes it clear that he needs Atu and asks her to relax, because to him, she is unique and special. And my friends, this almost killed the elf. The guy's words were so firm that they hammered her heart to the point that it almost stopped working. At that moment, she can only think about when the two of them will finally get married and live happily ever after. After that, Takuto takes Maria and Karia to visit Minogara's clinic, a low-cost facility where the population's illnesses are treated. But the real reason for the visit is that the girl's escort is waiting inside.
Atu wonders if it's who she thinks it is, and the king confirms. It's the unit he just created.
We then get a glimpse of the three figures created by the king, and while Karia's face tensed with fear, Maria's, in turn, lit up with excitement. However, despite their sinister appearance, the trio behaved in a completely hyped up and enthusiastic way for the chance to meet King Takuto. Their joy was so contagious that Atu gave her approval, and the king explained that he had created them as a precaution, to be ready for the worst. Still, Karia, uncomfortable, asked who they were, and our protag replied that they were combat medics, healers capable not only of treating wounds and illnesses, but also of throwing down in a brawl and protecting the two young elves. In the king's name, Atu then announced that the medics would accompany Maria and Karia to Dragontan and were in charge of defending them, as well as observing the culture and the current state of those lands. The mention of such a human-like mission sent the trio into even greater excitement. Their bizarre behavior left the elves perplexed, some for the better, some not so much. But the medics swore they were exemplary human beings, born for tasks like this. And the spontaneity of these lunatics was so intense that we see Maria running to greet them as if they were old friends.
And pause to talk about this sort of tokusatsu moment of theirs, with Maria in the middle. I was dying laughing. Our boy Takuto was also happy, and because of that, felt an urge to reward their loyalty, declaring that he would grant them a prize. Since they seemed strangely obsessed with the subject, the sovereign gave them proper human names: Ichido, Jiro, and Saburo. The three of them grinned from ear to ear. Upon receiving his name, Ichido swore to honor the blessing by carrying out his duty flawlessly. Soon, even Maria was caught up in the doctor's theatrics, which made Takuto wonder if perhaps he hadn't gone too far. Curious, he asked Karia what she thought of it all, and she, who was probably cringing hard with secondhand embarrassment, just managed to say they would do their best. Worried, Atu assured the girls that if they got into trouble, they could always turn to her. The scene changes, and sometime later, in the city of Dragontan, its mayor was sitting, fuming with rage. She had left her perfectly ordered elven homeland, convinced she would finally find a handsome husband and live a comfortable life. Instead, all she did was drown in work and bureaucracy. Slamming her mug on the desk with a vibe very much like Tsunade when she complained about being Hokage, she cursed the fact that she now had to rely on the forces of darkness to defend her city. At that exact moment, someone entered Mayor Antic's office. In a flash, she dropped her aggressive demeanor and forced on a sweetness that was faker than a $3 bill. Her assistant explained, embarrassed, that some visitors wanted to meet with her but had no appointment. The mayor immediately demanded they be sent away. After all, her time was worth more than gold. But then her secretary mentioned they were emissaries from Minagra. With that, Antic nearly exploded, berating her staff for not saying so earlier, as this was top priority. And someone please adjust this lady's meds because she is not okay. And so the leader of Dragontan received her guests, introducing herself as Antilise Antic. Still, the haunting aura of Minagra's combat medics unsettled her. She couldn't understand why the staff bearers had allied with such terrifying creatures. Instead of speaking, she thanked them graciously. When the elf sisters stepped forward, she praised their manners, but inside, all she could think about was the dark reputation of the dark elves. However, they weren't the real threat there. The real concern was the three standing behind them. Upon hearing the surname Elfer, she remembered Tunicapoli saying that these very girls were the future leaders of Minagra, personally trained by the King of Ruin himself. Realizing how important her guests were, Antic visibly flinched. After all, if she handled this wrong, it could be a disaster. With her nerves on edge, she asked what brought them to Dragontan. When Karia and Maria hesitated, Jiro stepped forward, offering to speak on their behalf. He explained that the visit was simply a response to Pepe's invitation to enjoy the city, a first step towards friendship between their domains. Relieved, Antic smiled, realizing they weren't there to negotiate treaties. Still, she knew it was better not to risk annoying them, and since she was dying for an excuse to escape work, she offered to personally guide the sisters around the region. Meanwhile, watching from afar through magic, Takuto felt reassured that everything was going well, although Atu grumbled that he had abandoned her to deal with the paperwork they promised to finish together. As night fell, the ambassadors from Minagra said goodbye to the mayor, leaving a favorable impression. Later, back in their quarters, the sisters sat down to review the day's findings. Maria, with a worried look, admitted that what struck her most was the fear she felt seeing so many hungry and insecure people, weighed down by the war. The doctors were impressed with her perceptions, to which Karia revealed to them that her sister was sensitive to the emotions of others. This made them strike their characteristic poses, declaring it was a remarkable power. In fact, they believed it was this empathy that led her to ask them to buy a pretty plant at the market, which they now placed in her hands. Maria had no idea, but her sister instantly recognized it as popil, an herb that induced euphoria and hallucinations, so dangerous that it was banned in several countries. The moment Maria heard that, she threw the plant away. Karia suspected, judging by its pristine condition, it probably had been cultivated, especially since it was being sold openly in Dragontan's market. The scene then changed, and now the sisters were taken to the Dragon Vein mine. Seeing the brilliant minerals, they remembered their mother's words that the world was full of wonders. Just then, a merchant approached, introducing himself as Vesta Kirkland. Karya asked what he wanted to discuss. He said he wanted to talk business, mentioning he heard this land would be under joint control with Minagra, asking if they would be willing to cultivate the popal herb there with him and split the profits. Look at the ideas on this bandit. He then invited the sisters to meet with him later at sunset. Obviously, the Elfer sisters didn't show up for the meeting, which led that bastard Vesta to invade the mayor's office, flanked by two goons, to hear their answer in person. Antic was shocked as she hated Vesta and his schemes, but Kari was quick to make things clear. She would never work with a man like him, and their absence at the meeting should have made that perfectly obvious. Since this man represented a threat to the city, the emissary of Minagra asked to deal with him personally, and Antic, more than willing, gave her blessing. With that, Ichido, Jito, and Saburo stepped forward to face the merchant. However, strangely, Vesta remained far too calm. At that moment, he pulled a vial from his pocket containing a purple serum. Karya suspected it was a concentrated extract of the popal herb. Before anything else, she asked if the man understood what he was doing, because by attacking emissaries, he was effectively declaring a war on Minagra. Vesta, however, ignored the concern, as with a single injection, the young ladies would obey him every command. Confident in his scheme, Vesta handed the vial to one of his men and walked out. However, the instant he stepped through the door as his subordinates attacked, the sword of one of them was thrown aside, flying so close it almost pierced the merchant's skull. Turning around in shock, he realized that nothing had gone as planned. The scene changed, and in parallel, we see our boy Takuto having tea with his faithful companion. Emle arrived, curious as to why the kingdom had sent doctors as bodyguards. Atu then explained that those combat doctors loved humans so much that they developed unique abilities. In fact, they were known as the Brain Eaters, and they were as skilled as healing as they were at killing. Back in the mayor's office, Vesta was horrified at what had become of his men. The three Brain Eaters revealed their true nature, planning to strip the flesh from the dead to look even more human. Vesta demanded to know what these creatures were, and with an unshakable conviction, they answered that they were human, just like the merchant. Not even Antic could stomach the sight and collapsed on the floor, overcome with despair. Maria gently strokes the mayor's head, trying to console her, while Karya orders her subordinates to finish it quickly. Vesta argues that the elf shares his same alignment, as if that was reason enough to be spared, but the girl makes it clear that the two are not in the same position. What's more, Vesta showed open contempt for the beloved ruler of Minagra, a crime that could never be tolerated. Finally, just as Takuto once told her, Karya remembers that evil people are free. That is their nature. And so, with the king's approval, she chooses to exercise that freedom by putting an end to this opponent. Near death, the merchant begs for his life, but the elf coldly orders the masked lords to live up to their name. After the brutal brawl, the healers cover themselves with the skins of the fallen men, feeling more human than ever. Karya apologizes for leaving the mayor's office drenched in blood, and then politely asks if she can cover the cost of the cleanup. Seeing Karya's pure and simple joy at the gesture, Antic can't believe this little girl can remain so carefree in the middle of something so grotesque. The unease that comes with this realization terrifies her so much that she ends up, well, you can see for yourself. Noticing the awkward scene, the Birdbrains promise to do the same so their ally wouldn't have to suffer such a humiliation alone. But Karya dives at the three with a flying kick, stopping them from committing such an atrocity. And so, after witnessing one insanity after another, Antic starts to laugh, sort of from nerves at the whole situation.
The scene changes, and now we see our boy Takuto facing the consequences of what went down in Dragonton, where Otto is absolutely chewing our protag out for giving his assistants too much freedom and letting them raise hell over there.
The elf figured out he was watching from a distance and questioned why he didn't warn them via telepathy to not cause so much damage, and he, looking like an extremely spineless dad, just replied that he didn't do anything because he didn't want them to hate him, especially since they're at a complicated age and all. Otto took the chance to flip out a little more, asking if he's their father by any chance and if he's the type of dad who lets the mom do all the scolding when things get rough, avoiding any confrontation just to stay the cool dad. And before the simp can answer, she turns to the girls and asks what was going through their heads when they conspired with Takuto to cover up the truth. With no answer, her fury turns to the three medics, who are nothing more than maniacal butchers that apparently skinned people alive in front of Dragonton's mayor. And despite the elf's foul mood, the lunatics cheerfully claim that they've now become a little more human, and the comment from these bastards only makes the situation worse. As punishment, Otto demands that everyone write an essay of repentance, to which everyone agrees. Sometime later, in the conference room, the assistant announces it's time to discuss what to do about Dragonton. At that moment, Takuto was handing out candies to reward his precious daughters, which of course makes Otto question if these troublemakers are actually remorseful. The scolding got so intense that even Gia had to ask her to take it easy, until finally the elf cools her head and admits she went too far. With that, Moltar opens the meeting and asks the Elfer sisters if the investigation unfolded exactly as it was written in the report, and Caria confirms that it did. From there, the elder remarks that the city seems to be unstable, and Emily points out that crime has been rising and that Dragonton is still dealing with goblins, orcs, and hill giants. For Gia, the first two are manageable, but the giants are a whole other level of problem. If nothing is done, it's only a matter of time before Dragonton is history. In other words, this means that Minogra's forces must be dispatched as quickly as possible. Emily agrees, but refuses to split the kingdom's forces as it would harm construction in agriculture. Otto then declares that she'll personally be part of the support cent, and Moltar presumes it's because of her ability to steal others' skills. The king agrees, saying he had already decided to send her anyway. With that, the elder takes on the responsibility of forming an escort for this key figure, while Gia in turn states that his warriors will focus on national defense. Emily admits she still feels uneasy since the local defense has depended heavily on Otto. Facing this situation, the King of Ruin appoints the heroine, Isla, as the new centerpiece of the kingdom's defense, because as her production is nearly complete, she will soon be crucial. A little worried, Caria asks what kind of person this heroine will be. Through telepathy, Takuto asks Otto what she thinks will happen, and she replies that she has no idea. Even so, Takuto hopes nothing bad will happen, and if Isla turns against the king, Otto swears she'll protect him with her life. And so finally, the Sovereign of Minogro begins the ritual. The magical process produces an egg that slowly cracks until a creature emerges from its shell. When the summoning is complete, Isla lets out a roar that stuns all the gathered citizens. With surprising formality, the giant creature declares it an honor to receive such trust, and confesses that her entire body trembles with pure joy at the chance to serve her master once more. Takuto is surprised she recognizes him, while Otto questions if Isla is really being honest. To the elf's surprise, the Queen of Insects not only remembers her, but even pets her head, teasing how adorable she looks when she tries to act all tough. In any case, Isla assures them she isn't lying. The days she spent alongside Takuto are etched in her being, and one thing she remembers clearly is that he was the only one capable of drawing out her full power. And, she adds, Otto was always Takuto's favorite among favorites. Changing the subject, Isla asks her master to explain the current situation. Later that night, Isla learns every detail about what has been happening, and our protag admits there's much he doesn't understand, but thanks to Otto's help, he's managed to get this far. The elf replies that if she'd been on her own, she would have taken her own life. Isla comments that she doesn't want to be a third wheel, but that she's already understood the gist of it. Her duty is to protect this peaceful nation, while Otto's mission is to annihilate Dragonton's enemies. Hearing this reminder, the elf bursts into tears. Knowing she'll miss her beloved king, Takuto replies that he'll miss her dear friend as well. But right now, she's the only one he can rely on. Being honest, he admits he's worried about not being able to communicate well with the Dark Elves without her around. Overcome by his sincerity, she replies that the two of them have always been together since the day they arrived in this world. When they embrace, Isla quickly realizes she probably shouldn't be watching this moment. The next morning, the delegation bound for Dragonton bids farewell. Though it's painfully difficult, Otto manages to part from her king and sets out on her mission. From now on, Takuto must rely on Isla to protect the nation. But for real, he already seems lost minutes after being without his assistant. Isla notices he looks like an abandoned child and asks when exactly he plans on waking up for real. From behind the throne, Caria and Maria add that their ruler never wakes up before noon, and if he doesn't wake up on his own, someone has to drag him out of bed. From this, Isla concludes that the king is really a big baby, but she makes a point of telling him directly. After all, he is the great leader of Minogra, and it wouldn't be good for his image if everyone found out he sleeps until noon. From now on, she insists he must wake up earlier, to which he promises he'll try. Caria comments that Isla is completely different from Otto, who's always coddling the boy. With this, Isla asks to borrow the Elfer sisters as guides, and her boy Takuto grants her request. Before leaving, Isla reminds him that soon the people will come for the king's approval, so he must keep his composure. As soon as the three leave, Emily arrives with a request for the king to approve the division of the workforce. Lost without his faithful companion, Takuto signs the document without even reading it. Right after, Gia shows up with another document, and Takuto prepares himself to finally act like a real king until Otto returns. And I don't even know what's going to happen with this anymore. Meanwhile, Isla asks the Elfer sisters what they know about the nation's facilities. Suddenly, Emily runs over exasperated to say that Gia broke the training equipment again, and she's tired of having to adjust the budget to fix his screw-ups. On top of that, she confesses she's overwhelmed by Moltar's absence. Isla gently strokes the elf's head and promises to scold the general later. Speaking of the officer, he storms through a line of recruits, furious, breaking each of their wooden swords with a single blow. According to him, none of these men are ready to defend their homeland. In the middle of this, Isla intervenes, reminding him that before drilling his men, he needs to recount his equipment stock. Nervous, the elf starts stammering until the insect gently pats the general's head and says that being so obsessed only proves his immaturity, and that he really wants to protect the king, he must keep a cool head. Gia grumbles that his authority might be undermined if he keeps getting head pats, but it's obvious that he doesn't want the heroine to stop doing it. Suddenly, the dinner bell rings. In line at the dining hall, the heroine is offered a special bowl. Isla, however, thanks them for the gesture, but insists on using the same dishes as everyone else. After all, she believes she can only call herself a true heroine if she shares the same perspective and feelings as the people. At that moment, Maria whispers something to her sister, and together they present the Queen of Insects with a plate and bowl made especially for her, with the heroine's face carved in the wood. This way she could eat with the same dishes as everyone else, but with a personal touch. Later that night, Isla patrols Minogra thinking about defensive strategies until she hears Caria and Maria crying. She immediately goes to them to find out why they can't sleep. Through tears, they explain that they always dream of happy moments with their mother, only to wake up and realize it was just a fantasy. Despite the strength the sisters show, Isla decides to sleep beside them, and the comfort feels so maternal that the girls experience a peace they hadn't felt in a long time. When morning comes, the heroine goes before the king and explains that after talking with Emily, she decided to recommend building an educational facility. On top of that, she suggests planting living thickets to protect the nation. She adds that this decision came from a conversation with Caria the night before. The elf had expressed her desire to learn more to be useful to the king, and that thought spurred her mind. With that said, Isla asks about the Otto situation, and he then activates his farsight ability and sees his aide alone, facing a horde of enemies advancing on the walls of Dragonton.
And just when I thought Otto was going to have a hard time with the enemies, we see that in reality, she smashed them with frightening ease. A sight that left even Antilai speechless. And even though she was there soiling her diapers in fear, she was obviously grateful for the help. Seeing what that woman was capable of, Antilais made sure to remind everyone that she had treated the Elfer sisters with great kindness, and that now their two nations were allies. But since the mayor was clearly on edge, Otto told her to go rest a little and leave the rest to her. The scene changed, and now we see the gang serving a drink to Otto, while Moltar comments that they were getting along surprisingly well with the locals. as he expected the citizens of Dragonton to be much more afraid of them. But apparently Pepe helped a lot with that connection. Hearing the boy's name made Otto remember the time he saw her tentacles and called her an octopus. She was about to explode at him, but the boy suddenly remembered he needed to go back to Lua Crescente and left Dragonton in the elf's care, leaving her speechless. Changing the subject, the elder asked about her looting of the barbarian's skills, to which she assured him it was going very well, because despite being weak, the group had surprisingly decent abilities. Suddenly, Dragonton's defenders spotted a hill giant approaching. The fact that they hadn't detected it sooner was bizarre, since not even Moltar sensed any mana being used. Otto wanted to find out the trick behind these sudden appearances. In the middle of this, Antilles ran over breathless to warn about the giant's arrival, and said she was preparing the archers. But our dear Otto simply said she could handle it alone, something the mayor even tried to protest, but the heroine of Minogra had already shot forward at high speed. In any case, Moltar assured the others that the hill giant was too weak to be a challenge for Otto. Still, the old man was tired of just watching and thought it was time to join the brawl too. With that, he invoked the Land of Ruin, a spell that enveloped him in a cloud of smoke that launched itself near the giant, causing an explosion. The enemy began to suffocate, while it's explained to us that this magic not only increases the strength of evil-aligned units within its range, but also decreases the strength of units with a different alignment. As a consequence, not only did the giant lose power, but Otto became even more powerful. And because of that, the monster was sliced in half by Otto's sacred sword arts. After it fell, she noticed it had dropped some gold coins. She reported this immediately to King Takuto, while Moltar mentioned he had never seen those gold coins before. Hearing this, Takuto used his vision-sharing magic to analyze the object and recognized the crest stamped on it. It belonged to the brave conquerors. At that moment, the Demon King's army began to advance toward Dragonton, and observing the movement, Takuto murmured that their enemy was an RPG. Far away, soldiers of the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, led by the Saint, were shocked by the devastation a witch had caused in a small town. While trying to rescue survivors, the men were suddenly annihilated by a dark spell. The one responsible for the massacre then appeared, Arakino, the devouring witch. Unfazed by the grotesque presence, the saint recalled that Qualia had already passed divine judgment on this enemy 17 times. So she wondered, how was Arakino still alive? The witch laughed, claiming she really had kicked the bucket all 17 times and that not even she knew why she was still here. The saint pressed her, but Arakino had no patience for questions, cutting the conversation short by reviving the village's dead, including the saint's own soldiers, turning them into zombies. Even so, Selena couldn't hesitate, and with a thunderous blast of fire magic, she disintegrated all the enemies around her. Without mercy, the saint charged forward, driving the sharp tip of her staff straight through the witch's stomach. And, well, we see the result of this was the 18th time Arakino bit the dust. She knew she would return, but at least this bought her kingdom some precious time to prepare. Back in Dragonton, a soldier ran to warn the mayor of an approaching enemy army. Speaking with Otto via telepathy, Takuto explained that their enemy was an RPG that had been widely played, called Brave Conquerors. In that game, you play as the hero to defeat the final boss, the Demon King. This was a legendary title known as the progenitor of most PC RPGs, and the reason Minogra scouts couldn't detect the enemy's arrival, because in that game, there were simply no warnings for random encounters with enemies, something their foes were using to their advantage. Isla then asked if her master had ever played it before, and with that in mind, the king says yes, and tells Otto he'll tell her how to win this fight. In parallel, inside the Demon King's castle, the Sovereign of Darkness was ordering his troops to crush the enemy. We then return to the battlefield near the walls of Dragonton, where Frozen Rock asked Flamejo if the king had given any specific orders.
The fire beast replied that it was the same as always, and that they were free to use whatever monsters and tactics they wished. With that, Frozen Rock summoned the troops, ordering them to attack Dragonton with all force. And while he ran to the front lines, Flame Joe showed some peculiar behavior, mentioning he would pursue his own personal goals. On the battlefield, Frozen Rock and his warriors advanced, until Moltar smoke spread, suffocating the army. The giant quickly noticed that the orcs and goblins were suffering, while pure demons, like himself, were getting stronger. That's when Atu appeared, taking out the mage instantly. She then realized she was face to face with Frozen Rock, one of the 4 generals. Curious, the giant demanded to know who she was, to which she introduced herself as a unit from the 4X strategy game called Eternal Nations, loyal to the powerful king of ruin, Iratakuto, and that her name was Atto Lacamenta, tasked with eradicating all who dared to challenge Minogra. Up on the wall of Dragonton, as the archers rained down arrows, Mare Antalize was ordering an evacuation. Moltar interrupted her, saying that there was no need to go that far. After all, Minogra was by her side. Antalize protested, but then distant explosions and monstrous screams echoed. According to the Elder, that was Lacamenta in action, and victory was assured. On the battlefield, after dodging wave after wave of ice spears, Atto advanced with confidence, exactly as King Takuto had foreseen. As he explained, RPG battles usually revolve around small parties, but in 4X strategy games, the scale is entire armies. In other words, this meant that a single unit's attack targeted the entire enemy force, giving Minogra an overwhelming advantage. Because of this, even if Atto was facing an entire army alone, they were no match for her. Frozen Rock demanded to know why she was interfering. After all, she was evil too, wasn't she? In that case, shouldn't she bow to her lord so they could wipe out the humans together and rule the world? Atto laughed her ass off, mentioning that's crazy since she already has a hell of a lot of work just building a single nation. Ruling the whole world sounds to her like something idiotic, worthy of someone who either doesn't think or loves bureaucracy. Frozen Rock tilted his head, not understanding the language the crazy lady was speaking, to which our dear elf laughed, thinking that this character's plot probably wasn't very well developed, because, at the end of the day, hardly anyone cares about a mid-boss from an RPG after defeating them. She continued, revealing that this very unit had been defeated countless times by the hero of her game. The words hit him hard, and memories of merciless defeats flooded the giant's mind. Blinded by rage, he charged at her, but the elf blocked every blow with ease. She was delighted to have made him remember what he really was, and took the chance to taunt him, asking how it felt to know he existed only to be defeated. Still in denial, he bellowed that he was Frozen Rock, the General of Ice, and that he is the one who crushes all that oppose the great and powerful Demon King. Atto laughed again, mentioning that in this world there is only one king, and his name is Iratakuto. Then she challenged him to use his strongest attack, to which he roared and conjured the glacial decapitation. As Atto, all confident, thinks that a measly attack like that would never stop her. But however, and nevertheless, plot twist, my dudes, because what we see is that the Psycho's sword lands a nasty hit on our elf, causing sludge to leak from the wound. She falls to the ground while Frozen Rock boasts about his most powerful attack. But what he didn't expect is that this blow would make her go absolutely Joker mode with rage. With a single attack mixed with a lot of anger, she impaled him with half a dozen tentacles, while the cold and not so calculating enemy, in his last breath, just managed to mention a slow and pained "Long live the Demon King," as he exploded and made it rain coins everywhere. As for Atto, even though she won, she was indignant for having taken that hit. While she was living through her personal grief, she realized she received the glacial decapitation ability from Frozen Rock, where she can unleash a powerful ice element attack with a guaranteed hit, with the trade-off that she won't be able to move for a while.
She realizes how OP the ability is for guaranteeing a hit, reflecting on how different it is to fight against a different game genre, as their mechanics are different. In any case, the elf remembers it's time to file her report and informs her master that she has defeated one of the 4 generals.
But at that moment, she feels her heart skip a beat, as she has just realized something terrifying. There is an enemy in Minogra, and it's that bastard Flamejo. At that moment, we see a commanding man standing atop a fortress wall, gazing out over the land below. Leading his troops, he is certain that all of this will soon belong to him. Back in Minogra, a soldier rushes in to warn the king of the enemy force's approach. However, Takuto already knew. It was one of his innate abilities. Isla steps forward, declaring that she will escort the king and the Elfer sisters to the residential quarters. Worried, the Elfer sisters ask if the situation is really that bad. The heroine reassures them. Everything will be fine. After all, they have Isla and Takuto to protect them. Still, the insect admits she hadn't anticipated such a direct attack. According to Isla, there's a chance that her opponent, the Demon King, is a player, just like Takuto. But for the King of Ruin, that doesn't matter one bit. Whoever this rival is, there's no longer any chance of peace, not after Minogra crushed one of his 4 great generals. From now on, the enemy must be crushed with overwhelming force. Outside the palace, Takuto and the heroine review their forces to craft a strategy. For now, he has Isla, the queen of insects, as the heroine of defense. Beyond her, Minogra can also rely on Gia, leader of the Dark Elves. The Brain Eaters are only 3, but each possess special healing abilities. And then there are the larvae Isla has created. The heroine regrets not foreseeing the battle and creating more larvae, but Takuto reminds her there's no use crying over spilled milk. Karia and Maria say that the people of Minogra are very grateful for the larvae. Isla, moved, embraces the girls with maternal warmth. Meanwhile, Emle informs the king that the evacuation of non-combatants has been completed. Shortly after, Jianajiv sends an estimate of the enemy forces. First of all, Takuto is quietly pleased. His subordinates are acting independently, something impossible when he was playing on a computer. Finally, Gia brings the news. About 1,000 enemy soldiers have crossed into their territory. Takuto orders Gia to focus on defending the capital, suspecting that one of the great generals might be hidden among them. With a faint smile, he begins to shape a plan. Seeing his expression, Isla believes her master has already decided. Takuto confirms. It's time to show these RPG players what it means to face the forces of a true 4X game. Isla assumes he's referring to emergency unit production, a common tactic in strategy games. But that's not what Takuto has in mind. Instead, he pours all of Minogra's mana reserves into the Queen of Insects, granting her the strength to level up and unlock devastating abilities. Among them, predation and parasitic eggs. Takuto explains that after the battle in Dragonton, he already has a good idea of how the enemy fights. Even if one of the great generals shows up, the Queen of Insects can handle it. Before she leaves, Takuto warns her to be careful with RPG mechanics. Isla remembers how Ado was caught by surprise, but assures him she won't make the same mistake. The Elfer sisters, calling her mother, bid her farewell with heavy hearts. Deep within the forest, Flamejaw's forces begin to feel the terror of that grim, haunted wood. A soldier wonders aloud why they were forced to split from Frozen Stone's contingent. The mage beside him suspects the operation lacks the Demon King's approval. Suddenly, a comrade stumbles, his face twisted in agony as hideous lumps emerge from his body. The lumps burst open, revealing Isla's larva. From that moment, the forest was swarming with the creatures. The demons decided to retreat until the voice of the queen insect echoed. Her colossal form didn't appear, but her presence was undeniable. She scolded the cowardice of her enemies. Enraged, the troops demanded that she reveal herself, and Isla granted their wish. Moments later, the battle was already over. In the blink of an eye, she had annihilated every last one of them. That's when Flamejaw appeared. He admitted, with a touch of sadness, that her harsh judgment of his soldiers hurt him. Isla introduced herself, declaring the honor it was to serve the King of Ruin, Takuto.
In return, the Demon King's general revealed himself as Flamejaw, the Demon of Flames. To his surprise, Isla was delighted to discover that one of the great generals had actually appeared. By the way, she casually remarked that the Ice Rock had been in Dragonton. That little jab was enough for Flamejaw to realize his comrade had been slain. He wasn't shocked, though. The Ice General was the weakest of the four, but the Demon of Flames, he wouldn't fall so easily. Isla mocked his excessive confidence, but Flamejaw wasn't finished. Brimming with arrogance, he boasted that killing her would be as easy as stealing candy from a child. Annoyed by his insolence, Isla reminded him that dogs that bark don't bite. Flamejaw's response? He bared his fangs like a rabid hound, igniting a fierce blaze that engulfed his body. Meanwhile, back in the kingdom, Takuto was monitoring the battle. When you pit an RPG-style character against one from a 4X game, the 4X always comes out on top. In short, it was only a matter of time before the Demon of Flames was defeated. On the battlefield, Flamejaw unleashed tremendous power, but Isla proved surprisingly agile. With each strike, Flamejaw pressed the attack not just with his fists, but with his words. He tried to get inside her head, but on the contrary, with her larva by her side, she was more interested in teaching him a lesson about respecting women. Still, he complained that it was not fair for only Isla to have pawns at her disposal, so he summoned his own subordinates. Curious, Isla asked why this demon was so determined to attack Minogra. As she asked the question, she sent waves of larvae tunneling beneath the soil toward the enemy troops. In no time, their bodies were overrun by swarms of insects and swiftly consumed. Frustrated, Flamejaw demanded to know what she thought of herself. That question gave Isla an opening, and she replied that he seemed to be the one lost about his own identity. The Demon of Flames exploded in a rage. Consumed with anger, Flamejaw confessed his hatred. He despised the freedom Isla enjoyed, the freedom to serve his master by her own will, something he had never experienced. What, he demanded, did that feel like? Isla answered with a single word: happiness. Flamejaw, on the other hand, was nothing but a puppet. That brutal truth lodged itself in his mind like a blade. Enraged, Flamejaw swore he would take his freedom by force, by stealing the throne of Minogra. With that said, the demon flame unleashed an overwhelming surge of power. Invoking a tornado of fire, Flamejaw cut through the battlefield. His confidence in victory was unshakable, and reached its peak when his flames finally caught up with the Queen of Insects. But his triumphant grin quickly soured when he realized Isla hadn't been incinerated. Instead, she had shielded herself within an incredibly durable cocoon. The protective shell was burned away, but Isla herself emerged completely unscathed. To rub salt in the wound, she delivered a cutting remark. "Is that all? Is this the extent of your hunger for freedom?" From that moment on, Flamejaw lost all control, burning through his mana as if there were no tomorrow. His relentless storm of fire was reduced to nothing more than a spectacular but useless display. Isla evaded his frenzy, closed in, and drove her claw across his abdomen. On the brink of death, Flamejaw's mind wandered. In the end, he realized too late that he had always been nothing more than a puppet. Isla's claw tore him in two, ending the reign of the demon flame. Watching from a distance, Takuto praised the heroine's performance, but the victory was shadowed by unease. Suddenly, communication between the two was cut, and when Takuto's dishes slid off the table without reason, he knew something was terribly wrong. Without explanation, Karia and Noria appeared at Isla's side. Alarmed, the insect queen ordered her larva to guard the elves. And then, even with his body split apart, Flamejaw's lips twisted into a wicked smile, one that suggested his death was only the beginning. Isla asks what the girls are doing there, but they have no idea themselves. Takuko tries to reach them but can't. All he sees is the mocking smile of the enemy general. Fearing what might happen next, Isla summons the Brain Eaters with a scream that echoes throughout Minogra. She pleads for the King of Ruin to answer her call, but no response comes.
On the way, however, she comes face to face with Flame Joe and realizes that even after being cut in half, he's still alive. When the demon bursts into laughter, Isla tears at his shoulder, but he keeps breathing. Suddenly, the system announces that the self-defense event has been triggered and that key characters will be protected. At that moment, Takuto remembers the Flame Joe event from the game Brave Conquerors. In it, players thought they had defeated the Flame General, only for him to return with a second life. On the battlefield, Flame Joe never stops taunting his opponents. Then, out of nowhere, a hostile red energy engulfs Isla's body, paralyzing her. Flame Joe sneers, saying he's been through this ridiculous script countless times. Kiria and Maria, also seized by that energy, are forced to advance against their will. Isla realizes this must be one of those RPG mechanics her master mentioned. The general revels in the moment, laughing that the Insect Queen now has a front row seat to watch the death of the two brats she loves so much. He even names this vile mechanic the mandatory event. Kiria and Maria panic, crying that they don't want to die, but Isla keeps promising she'll protect them. Straining against the strange prison, she tears her own body apart. Flame Joe only laughs harder, saying everyone is a pawn in this game. He curses Era Takuto, spitting that he's nothing but another player, but Flame Joe insists he's still here and swears he'll kill the ruined king's precious elf sisters just for fun. With that, the general conjures a massive fireball, swallowing the entire battlefield in flames. The scene shifts. We're taken back to a moment in the past when the Elfer sisters climbed a tall tree to gaze out over Minogra. Maria pointed to the moon, so large, so bright. It reminded her of something King Takuto once told her. When you ask someone if they think the moon looks beautiful, what you're really saying is that you love them. Kiria had never heard this before. Playfully jealous, she pouted. The truth was, the sisters were always deeply connected. Maria asked Kiria if she thought the moon looked beautiful. Blushing, she answered yes, then suggested that next time they bring Mother Isla along so they could ask them the same question. Back to the present, the sisters wake up in the middle of a vast crater, completely unharmed. The reason? Isla had used her own body to shield them from the explosion, and the damage it inflicted on her was devastating. The sisters scream in despair, clinging to their mother, while the Insect Queen feels that despite everything, she has fulfilled her duty. At that moment, Isla tells them not to worry about treating her. Instead, she asks them to listen carefully. As she finishes speaking, her last remaining arm dropped lifelessly to the ground. Isla makes it clear she will not survive. The girls sob, convinced it only happened because they were weak, but Isla tells them they are not to blame. Maria and Kiria then beg to die with their mother. So, as her final wish, Isla tore her own heart from her chest and asked forgiveness for dying before her daughters. Her final request was that the sisters eat this heart and go on living so that her ability, Pass the Crown, would be activated, allowing her to hand over all her power to the two girls. And so, while expressing her love for them, the Queen of Insects, after her heart shone intensely, collapsed onto the ground. Meanwhile, Atu was slaughtering enemies with authority. Tired of the endless fight since she only wanted to return to Takuto, Atu struck down 3 more giants. However, she suddenly felt a terrible reaction through her body and somehow discovered that Isla, the Queen of Insects, was dead. Soon that feeling turned into rage and the elf began slamming her tentacles furiously into the ground. Inside the palace, Takuto remembered that the Flame Joe event was infamous in the game, but should never have been possible in this world. When the boy tried to reach Isla and learned that this unit no longer existed, he fell to his knees. In the middle of that vast crater, Maria and Kiria ate their mother's heart to fulfill her final wish. The system glitched because 2 people were triggering Pass the Crown at once, but in the end both managed to gain the hero's power. Then the sisters joined hands and left that place, each with one eye changed forever by that dreadful process. Suddenly, Takuto finally managed to speak with Lamacenta, informing her that Isla had been defeated by being caught in a death event. The elf resolved to return to the capital as quickly as possible, but Takuto told her that the twins had survived and were moving south toward the enemy fortress, probably seeking revenge. In short, since the sisters could not be contacted, Atu would have to go after them. Concerned, Atu replied that these RPG-like mechanisms were a serious threat and that she ought to prioritize protecting the king. But Takuto insisted that his right hand must pursue the Elfer sisters as he had promised Isla that he would take care of them. Thus, even against her will, the assistant relented. Meanwhile, Kiria approached the enemy lines alone, where she faced the Lady of the Wind, the Storm General of the demon army. The demoness couldn't understand why the girl was alone. At the same time, Maria was dancing innocently in front of the old mechanic, the General of Earth. With a smile on his face, Maria shouted that the world hated her and Kiria. Then Kiria cast a spell that struck the Lady of the Wind's soldiers, who began to melt slowly and painfully until they died.
The general conjured the cursed black wind, but the blessing of light surrounding the young elf canceled the curse without effort. At once the lady's hand began to disintegrate. Her last words were a plea for help, but her face melted away completely, and she died in a hideous manner. As for Maria, she was struck by blasts from the Magitech, but a magical barrier shielded her with ease. Alarmed, the general ordered his squadron of mages to attack. Soon, with incomprehensible serenity, Maria asked the old mechanic if he believed in love, and then the mechanical armor suddenly forgot how to function. He ordered the mages to act, but they too forgot how to fight. Thus, the old mechanic resolved to attack himself, but he also forgot how to battle. Maria declared that the world hated them, and that was precisely why there needed to be more love. Mimicking the motion of eating, the elf bites into the wind, and in an instant, half of the earth mage's bodies are torn away. Desperate, the old mechanic calls for the Demon King's help, but Maria steps toward him and advises when fear takes over, forget everything. Because when you forget everything, only love remains. Then the game system announces a new threat rising in the world, the Elfer Sisters, the Witches of Regret.
Meanwhile, standing before his fortress, the Demon King is struck by the irony that these two little girls were the first to reach him. Fate certainly loves to play tricks, especially since it means they'll have to die here and now. After all, only when everything is destroyed and this world is offered as a sacrifice will the Demon King earn his freedom. That was the deal he made with God. Before the battle begins, he asks the sisters if they believe God exists. Both answer at the same time, no. With that, the king raises a dark barrier and declares they won't be able to lay a finger on him, since only a true hero has the power to shatter this shield. However, without the slightest hesitation, the Elfer sisters destroy it, making the Demon King question the promise that was made to him. There were no heroes left in this world. Regardless, it's clear the elves have no intention of talking as they advance in silence. The Demon King understands. After all, the hero he once knew was also a man of few words. With that, the ruler of darkness abandons his human guise and takes on his true form, a monstrous, towering beast. He admits it feels strange to transform right from the start, but with many of his old restrictions gone in this world, he can skip the phases of a game-like fight and go straight to the point, and his instincts warn him not to underestimate these foes. In an instant, he conjures and hurls dozens of blades at them, but Maria swats them away as if she were playing. Karya follows by spreading a plague across the ground, rotting the monster's legs. Then, they grab the weapons the demon himself had conjured and charge straight at him. Enraged when the twins nullify the curse on his blades, the Demon King strikes with his claws, but Karya raises her halberd and smashes one of his limbs. Together, they drive their weapons into his armor. Though the damage is severe, the demon insists he will not be defeated, because God is with him. He will stop at nothing to fulfill his pact and claim peace and freedom for himself. Maria grins darkly and says, "God doesn't exist." Karya adds that the only thing he'll find by clinging to that hope is more suffering. They both confess they lost everything because they once believed in God. Even so, the demon's faith doesn't waver. Through sheer willpower, he heals his wounds and fights on. But drunk on the thought that God is watching him, the Demon King carelessly speaks the divine name in vain, and in that instant, his body is ripped clean in half. At the same moment, a human-looking boy appears on the battlefield, awkwardly asking if he just did something stupid.
The L4 sisters demand to know why he interfered. As he stammers that it was just a coincidence, they grow more and more furious. Realizing they're about to attack, the boy warns them that with their current power, they could never hope to defeat him. Maria and Kateria find it strange. Everything about him feels like a lie, and his mere presence tainting the battlefield is reason enough to strike. But before they can, Hato Lamacenta appears to stop a bloody clash. With her glacial decapitation, a technique that never misses its target, she freezes the sisters' feet. She explains that the king sent her to summon them back. Their mission is already complete. The twins complain that the boy interfered, but Otto dissolves the ice and reminds them she's simply carrying out the king's orders.
Still, the sisters defy Ira Takuto's authority and refuse to let his advisors stand in their way. That insolence sparks Ato's fury, and she accuses them of growing arrogant with their newfound power. In response, she unfurls her massive tentacles, determined not to underestimate them. The frozen feet hinder her for a moment, but as she herself once proved when struck by that same ability, she'll soon be free to move again. And so long as she doesn't kill the girls outright, the king will forgive her. Or so she believes. Maria and Kataria insist they'll never allow Ato to block their path. After all, the king himself told them they could do as they pleased. What Ira Takuto had really told them one day was that they were free. They could do whatever they wished and would be forgiven as long as they did nothing wrong. If they behaved in a way that made their mother proud, he would always praise them. That memory makes the twins think of Isla, the surrogate mother who had raised them with boundless kindness in a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. She gave them the love of a true mother, something they thought they'd never feel again. Out of respect for Isla, they ask themselves what she would think of them acting this way. As that thought sinks in, night fades and morning arrives. Maria tells your sister it's time to stop. The two drop their weapons and apologize to Ato for their harsh words. Given the circumstances, Ato is willing to pretend none of it happened, so long as the brats follow orders from now on. Suddenly, the mysterious boy who interrupted the fight apologizes as well, before leaping toward the fortress. Lamacenta notices the school uniform he's wearing, and mutters that if he is the kind of entity Takuto suspects, she should leave him be for now. The sisters ask if Isla can be brought back to life, but Ato tells them the queen of insects is truly dead. Hearing that, the girls break down in painful sobs. Through telepathy, the king's right hand informs him she'll return soon. Alone in a house within the residential quarters, Takuto reflects that the mechanics of a 4X strategy game had been applied to this world, something he thought was his exclusive cheat. But now, they'd faced an enemy with a different kind of cheat, the mechanics of an RPG. And according to the King of Ruin, there are plenty of other game genres out there as well. Back in the desert where the battle had taken place, the boy who had interfered in the fight against the Demon King now appeared walking aimlessly across the barren emptiness. Step after step, he trudged on until finally collapsing to his knees. Overwhelmed, he poured out the absurd fear that had shaken him to his core. According to the boy, God had told him there were some beautiful girls in danger who needed saving, and that was the only reason he had thrown himself into such madness. In the middle of this confession, the girl who called herself his slave suddenly appeared, overjoyed, announcing her presence with bright energy. Her master, startled but relieved, asked her if she was all right, and she explained that God's mysterious power had shielded her from harm.
Putting that aside, she said she had received a message apologizing to her master. This only made the boy angrier, furious at the idea that he was being made a fool of. After all, it was that insane God who had thrown him into this world out of pure whim. Still, he admitted to himself, at least he had met his so-called slave here. Then, out of nowhere, a giant appeared behind him, but in less than a split second, the boy tore the monster apart into pieces, so fast that no one could even see how he did it. After all, as he himself declared, he had been blessed with the overpowered strength that was promised to him. And even though things didn't unfold exactly like the anime he had imagined, this mysterious young man resolved that he would save the world nonetheless. Meanwhile, among the ruins of a devastated village, Saint Selena encountered Arakino, the devouring witch, for the 19th time, and this time vowed to reveal the witch's secret. In each of the previous 18 encounters, the saint had ensured she was buried, but no matter if she was incinerated or sealed away, Arakino always returned. This made it clear. This calamity would never end until the truth behind these resurrections was uncovered.
On the other side, the witch swore to disrupt the saint's plans, because if she lost this time, her superiors would be furious. With that said, Arikino rolled the dice again. The result? 100, the highest possible number, a critical strike. Seeing the saint wounded, the witch could hardly believe it. After 18 failures, she had finally succeeded. All the careful adjustments to her build had finally paid off. She had truly become strong. Filled with joy, she lifted her face to the sky, asking her master for praise. In that moment, she remembered she still carried a request entrusted to her by the dice god, a request that had something to do with Minagra. Far away in Minagra, Takuto reflected that one day he might have to face enemies with different mechanics, and if the same situation happened again, they would be destroyed. Since he couldn't communicate through telepathy, Jaya knocked at the king's door to inform him that the guard around the palace had been restored and that he could return, but Takuto replied that he wished to be alone. When the commander left, he admitted to himself how miserably he was failing in this war because of his arrogance and naivete. Ayla was dead, and he had betrayed the twins' trust. Seized with rage, the boy slammed his fist into the floor, shattering the wooden boards beneath him and falling onto the grass below. Looking at his own fist, he wondered if it meant what he thought it did. To test it, he walked up to a tree and with a single punch brought it crashing down. A laugh burst out of him. This wasn't a game he was controlling from the outside, he was part of this world, which meant he was a unit, just like any other. Realizing this only now made him curse himself even more for letting Ayla die, but his expression showed he was determined to redeem himself.
Not long after, with the return of Atu Lamacinta and the Elfer twins, the advisor called an emergency meeting to deal with the sisters' insubordination. However, Takuto declared they would not be accused of any crime. Lamacinta was furious. Ignoring the laws of insubordination in wartime was setting a terrible example. But the one who asked forgiveness of everyone was none other than the ruined king himself. He admitted that it was his arrogance and carelessness that had caused it all. The dark elves were stunned. Never should a king apologize. Yet Takuto stood firm. What's more, he promised to bring Ayla back to life through ascension victory, achieved when a civilization evolves into a higher plane. If this world truly followed the mechanics of eternal nations, then Takuto swore he would reach that victory and restore all that had been lost. Atu was incredulous. The conditions for such a victory were impossibly strict. It meant, essentially, recreating the world itself, and once others discovered Minagra's goal, every civilization would turn against them. But Takuto was unfazed. He declared they would kill anyone who stood in their way. Through emergency production, he summoned a pile of modern firearms, rifles, pistols, and more, and vowed to conquer the world with them, as long as everyone worked together and followed his lead. Yet later that night, alone, the king admitted to himself that simply acting like Rambo wouldn't be enough. If he truly wanted to achieve ascension victory, he would need a far more elaborate strategy. He reviewed the current status of his civilization and questioned why all the dark elves were gathered in one place. Elsewhere, before a massive tree, Karya and Maria slid down its trunk after building a small sanctuary for the insect queen. According to Elder Moltar, Ayla would guard the nation's future from within this shrine.
The sisters waited anxiously for their mother's return, as promised by the king. But the truth was, the Dark Elves were worried about whether such a miracle could really be achieved. The ruined king was more frightening now than when they had first met him, and they doubted whether they could keep up with his plans. Kakuto overheard their conversation in secret. Maria and Kateria responded that their comrades sounded like children with all that fear. After all, only children lost their confidence out of fear, becoming unable to do what needed to be done. Moltar lets out a laugh after being scolded by two brats, while Emily admits they're right, and Gia reminds everyone that even the young don't hesitate to serve their king. For that reason, he declares he'll follow Takuto to the very end, even if the whole world turns against their nation.
With this, the 3 most important members of the clan take the lead in pledging their full trust to their ruler, proving that the Dark Elves are ready to give everything so that the King of Ruin can fulfill his purpose. Once the elves depart, Takuto climbs up to Iceless Sanctuary and gazes down at Minogara from above. Reflecting on how far the nation has come, he realizes how close he was to choosing the worst possible path. In the end, it was thanks to everyone here that a country unlike the one in the game could be built. The next day, inside the palace, Atu regrets not having told Takuto something important yesterday, but she promises herself she won't make the same mistake again. With all the determination in the world, she marches into the throne room only to find them being comforted by the Elford twins. Without hesitation, she joins the girls, gently patting the boy's head. It seems he's feeling down after getting carried away the day before and frightening everyone with his behavior. Lamachenta then suggests he reframe the way he speaks to his people. Taking this to heart, Takuko rises to his feet and declares that he will never again allow those who place their trust in him to suffer. That is why everyone must work together to achieve victory by ascension. Because, after all, the King of Ruin is the only one capable of making it happen. After all, he is without question the greatest player of Eternal Nations. And at this moment, both the episode and the season come to an end. So what did you think of this season of the anime? Would you like to watch a second season? Then let us know in the comments that you'd like a continuation in the future. Leave a like and a hype to boost the video so it can be delivered to more people, and subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any news.